I'm the Dolphin of France. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 526 Death penalty starts. No upper limit. Reims, a province adjacent to Paris. Reims District Court. Judge Fusson listened to the prosecutor's request to sentence the defendant to death by beheading, and his face was full of fatigue. In the past, he only tried petty thefts and damage to public property. This case involving hundreds of thousands of francs and the defendant being sentenced to death was the first time in his 20-year career as a judge that he was responsible for. To be honest, if he hadn't studied for 2 nights before the trial, he wouldn't be sure which law should be applied to this case. There is no way. There are too many cases about tax farmers recently. The High Court's schedule is full, so even the local court has to accept major cases. The defendant's lawyer immediately walked up to the podium and loudly refuted, "Your Excellency the prosecutor, my client, Mr. Boker, just failed to strictly follow the tax procedures and made mistakes in the tax calculation. It is a completely economic case and should not be sentenced so heavily. In fact, I think this case should be tried by the commercial court, not in the ordinary court." The prosecutor frowned and almost drove the lawyer off the podium, raised a stack of documents in his hand, and said in a cold voice, "Lawyer Corentin, you are really good at distorting the facts. In 1785, Boker arbitrarily collected taxes in advance and imposed huge fines on 41 farmers in Mission, causing 18 of them to go bankrupt. In the process, more than 9 people in these farmers' families died of hunger or disease. If they still lived in their own homes, all this could be avoided. In addition, Boker forged government tax documents in 1786 and collected 300 francs of industrial legacy tax from Mr. Blanche and others, causing Blanche's workshop to go bankrupt and Blanche to commit suicide. In the same year, Boker ordered his men to beat Mr. Nedger because of tax arrears. Nedger died 5 days later. Lawyer Corentin said in a shrill voice, "Objection. Mr. Inspector, first of all, people in Mission die of starvation and disease every year. Even if there was no fine, the 9 people you mentioned would probably not survive the year. As for Blanche, it's even more nonsense. How can you be sure that he didn't commit suicide because of a quarrel with others or just mental problems? And the situation in Niger is also full of doubts." He talked non-stop for half an hour, mainly changing the concept and making nonsense. Anyway, it happened a few years ago, and many evidences have disappeared. He has many ways to delay the trial of the case for a long time. If it can be delayed until the storm of the tax farmer incident has passed, perhaps a light sentence can be given. He can even try to get him acquitted by bribing the judge. He received 7,000 francs in lawyer fees from the Boker family, so he naturally has to do his best to help him get rid of the crime. The prosecutor was so angry at the lawyer's words that his face turned blue, but he was troubled by the short preparation time for this case. He had to be responsible for 4 cases about tax farmers. Recently, he had no time to collect detailed evidence. At present, the evidence and materials in his hands are basically handed to him by the tax bureau. He argued for a while, and the lawyer named Corentin suddenly changed the subject. "By the way, Mr. Prosecutor, the cases you mentioned today should be sued by the parties involved or their families alone. I think it is unreasonable for you to file a public prosecution based on these. Lawyers can always find new angles to play with the law. The families of those involved can't afford the cost of the lawsuit, and they don't even know how to sue," the prosecutor said angrily. "Otherwise Boker would have been in jail. Your Honor, the prosecutor is threatening my client." Afterwards, the prosecution and the defense argued for more than 2 hours, and Judge Fusson knocked the gavel helplessly and announced a recess. He had a hunch that with the experience of this lawyer, this lawsuit could last at least half a year. He returned to the lounge and was about to have a cup of coffee when a court employee knocked on the door with a well-dressed middle-aged man with a silky and shiny wig, who looked very prestigious. The middle-aged man motioned the staff beside him to leave and then said to the somewhat nervous Fusson, "Nice to meet you, Judge Fusson. I'm Cyprian, the special representative of the Royal Supreme Court, and I need to know some information about the case from you." An hour later, the Boca case was reopened. Lawyer Corentin continued to talk about this and that, but unexpectedly, he had just said a few words this time when he heard the judge knocking the gavel hard and interrupted him. "Defense lawyer, please don't say anything that is irrelevant to the case." "Yes, Your Honor." Corentin changed his angle to deal with the prosecutor, but was soon stopped by the judge. "Defense lawyer, your speculation cannot be used as evidence in court. If you do this again, I will warn you." The prosecutor was overjoyed and began to take the initiative with the obvious assistance of the judge. He quickly argued that Corentin was sweating profusely and retreated step by step. At 4 p.m., Judge Fussen symbolically sought the opinions of several court assistants, slammed the gavel, and said loudly, "This court formally declares that Poca has illegally levied taxes, murdered, defrauded, and forged official documents. The charges are established, and this court, in accordance with the Edict of Dawn and the Edict of Sernans, sentences Jacques de Poca of Touraine to be beheaded." The people of Corentin were dumbfounded. How could this be sentenced? Although I was at a disadvantage during the court defense, there were still many points in the case that could be used to argue, and the judge actually made the decision in less than a day. He hurriedly whispered to comfort the as hen-faced Boca, "Don't worry, there are many points that can be used to appeal this case. After all, a lot of evidence is gone. I will submit an application to the Court of Appeal tomorrow." Judge Force took a long breath. Just now, the big shot from the Supreme Court came to remind him that in all recent cases involving tax collectors, as long as the facts of the case are clarified, there is no need to pay too much attention to the details of the evidence, and the verdict will be pronounced as soon as possible. At this rate, the thick stack of tax collector cases in his hand will probably be completed in more than half a month. He originally planned to spend half a year handling these cases at the door of the court. When a bailiff heard the verdict, he immediately slipped out excitedly regardless of the violation of the regulations, and shouted anxiously to the people who were waiting outside, waiting for the result. "Beheading. It's beheading." The crowd suddenly burst into cheers like waves. "Great. The damn Boca is finally going to hell. Long live Judge Fursney. Thank God, the evildoers are finally punished." It can be said that there is almost no one in Reims who does not hate the tax collectors. Even if your family is not ruined by tax collectors, it is common for you to be charged a few sous more in taxes, or to be beaten with a stick by tax collectors when calling for payment. Now, how could they not rejoice when they learned that the tax collector was sentenced to death? Lawyer Corentin waited until dusk before carefully walking out of the Reims district court. He knew very well how bad the reputation of tax collectors was, however. As soon as he walked out of the door, something stuck on his face. He subconsciously reached out to touch it, and his hand suddenly felt sticky. At the same time, a foul smell filled his nose, causing him to vomit violently. More than a dozen people poured out around him, apparently waiting for him, cursing and throwing more unidentified objects at him. It wasn't until Corentin's servants helped him get into the carriage that the men chased him for 2 more streets before leaving Liénard, as well as the families of Blanchard who were related to the case. Only received the news the next day. They had no time to come to the local court to wait for the outcome of the trial, and they were all weighed down by the heavy life. No rest either. And the culprit who caused all this will soon pay for his crimes. To Corentin's great surprise, the efficiency of the French judicial system was suddenly frightening. He appealed for Pocadot, but it was rejected by the appeals court in just 1 day on the grounds that the evidence was clear and the verdict was reasonable. He had no choice but to appeal to the Supreme Court of Reims again, and this time he waited for 2 days. Then the court announced that it had upheld the original verdict and made a final ruling, ending his idea of continuing to appeal to the Supreme Court. Immediately afterwards, the execution date was set. 10 days later. Naturally, he didn't know that all this was the result of the Crown Prince asking the Supreme Court to supervise the courts in various places. Even when several senior officials of the Supreme Court suggested that he should be cautious about this matter, Joseph did not hesitate to replace the Chief Judge Assistant of the Supreme Court, the second in command. Joseph did not want to interfere with the judiciary. Although intervention in a royal society would be interference, it is just that the facts of these tax collectors' cases are actually very clear. There are basically no unjust cases when they are hanged, so there is no need to waste time and money on this. Judicial resources. Moreover, these tax collectors are all wealthy. The longer the lawsuit drags on, the more they can think of various ways to exonerate themselves. Just when Corentin repeatedly reviewed the trial process and began to doubt his professional abilities, he heard good news that restored his confidence. Recently, all cases related to tax collectors have been tried very quickly, and his case is even considered slow. Some cases are even decided in the morning, and the High Court announces the final verdict in the afternoon. Moreover, the death penalty rate in these cases is as high as 70%. Those who were not sentenced to death were basically sentenced to decades of imprisonment, and only a few were sentenced to exile or short-term imprisonment. Not a single case of innocence. The tax bureau always arrests people with a clear target in mind, and tax collectors who have truly committed no evil deeds will not go to court. In the early morning, Corentin had breakfast and came out for a walk from a hotel in the Saint-Germain district of Paris. He didn't dare to live in Reims recently because he was really afraid that the angry people would kill him sooner or later. Although he made 7,000 francs, if he could go back to a few days ago, he would never dare to take on Polkadot's case again. Read the newspaper. Read the newspaper. The newsboy yelled from across the street. News and pictures. The thugs who violently attacked the tax collector conducted a joint trial, and you can see the verdict for 1 sou and 5 deniers. Corentin raised his hand to summon the newsboy and bought a newspaper. When he opened it, he immediately saw the news. A total of 571 thugs who participated in attacking the tax officials or violently obstructed the tax officials from arresting the suspects were all sentenced to death. The vast majority of them are former tax collectors, that is, subordinates supported by tax collectors at the same time. The news also mentioned that, because there were a small number of nobles among the 571 people, in order to facilitate the unified trial results, the Paris Supreme Court sentenced them all to beheading, and the appeal was dismissed that same day. Like poker, these 500 people will be executed 10 days later. Southern suburbs of Paris in Foul's Villa. More than a dozen tax collectors and tycoons all bowed their heads sadly and remained silent. Naturally, they had already learned that a large number of tax collectors and their men were caught and quickly sentenced to death. This shows that they have failed to take the Queen's route through the Count of Artois and the Countess of de Benac, and the government has begun to deal with them. After a long while, a fat tax collector said, "I didn't expect Brian to be so ruthless this time. Is he going to force us to death completely?" Fould rolled his eyes at him and scolded, "This is simply not something Brian can do. The entire judicial system has been mobilized." HP nodded. "It seems that it should be the royal family's intention." Bor gritted his teeth and said, "I have long said that at that time, a sum of money should be allocated to support the High Court to fight against the royal family. But you stingy people don't agree. What's the use of talking about this now?" Baron Morel said, "The people from the tax bureau are staring at me all day long. If this continues, the fire will burn us sooner or later, since these tax farmer giants usually stay behind the scenes. The tax farming business is left to agents, and even tax farming negotiations involve a nobleman. In addition, they paid a large amount of hush money, so far, the tax bureau has no concrete evidence to arrest them. However, tax farming involves hundreds of millions of francs, and the flow of debts cannot be completely hidden. Moreover, they will summon lower-level tax farmers from time to time to issue instructions, so as long as the investigation continues, the tax bureau will definitely find them." Hope signaled everyone to be quiet and looked very calm and said, "Don't worry, everyone. Our arrangements in the caravan and Marseille port have been completed, and we will send people to negotiate with the royal family later. The royal family has arrested so many people this time and has gained enough benefits. They should just accept it as soon as possible. Otherwise, once there is a problem with trade in Mediterranean ports, there will soon be a lot of riots in France." Morel curled his lips and whispered, "I hope your method works, but I have decided to give up the funds in France and go to England. to hide for a while. Goldmead and several other tax collectors immediately expressed the same intention. French Central Eastern Province, Champagne. Gerald Bonnet handed a contract to the owner of Manor Mary and said with a smile, "You won't regret your decision today. In addition to giving you the most favorable purchase price, we will also provide you with a property insurance as long as the purchase amount exceeds 5,000 francs. In the future, if there is an accident with the goods, such as the wine becoming sour before it is sold, the insurance company will compensate you without having to return the goods to you." Bonnet is the second person in charge of the new caravan established by the French Trade Federation in the Champagne region. He was just a small businessman before. Although his business was not big, decades of hard work made him very skilled in business skills. When he saw that the Trade Federation offered an annual salary of 1,500 francs to recruit caravan management, he signed up without hesitation. His family's small business only made about 1,000 francs a year, and he still had to take risks. Chapter 527. Nothing can't be solved by throwing money at it. If there is, then keep throwing money at it. The owner of the manor, Mary, was immediately enlightened. When he heard this, he was worried about not being able to sell wine. Champagne is full of wineries with extremely high production. The local area can't digest so much wine at all. Most of the wine produced has to be sold to Germany. Unexpectedly, a caravan suddenly came to help him solve the problem today. And the transaction terms were more favorable than those of the previous caravans. In the past, every time the caravan returned from Germany, it had to return a lot of problematic wine. Some caravans even deducted a 5% sour wine discount before paying. But Mr. Bond told him that these can now be compensated through some property insurance and he doesn't have to pay a penny. This alone can reduce his losses by nearly 1,000 francs every year. Mary asked curiously, "Mr. Bonnet, how did you sign such a favorable insurance agreement? This is a trade secret." Bonnet shook his head first, then lowered his voice with an embarrassed expression. "But we are already friends, so I can reveal some to you. Our caravan belongs to the French Trade Union. The union signed a general contract agreement with the Royal Insurance Company, involving an insurance amount of nearly 1 million francs. So whether the caravan is robbed or the goods are accidentally damaged, they can get insurance compensation. Oh, ordinary caravans can never get such favorable conditions." Mary immediately showed a look of understanding and then smiled like an old fox. "If so, we can work together to get some benefits from the insurance company. For example, return some good wine as problematic goods, get the insurance money, and then sell it again. That won't work." Bonnet shook his head decisively. "There is an insurance company dispatcher in the caravan, and he will keep an eye on the goods at all times." "Just kidding. The trade union and the insurance company have the same boss behind them, the Crown Prince. How can they cheat themselves and let a small wine merchant take advantage of them?" Mary curled his lips regretfully and nodded. "Then let's do as you said. 310 francs per barrel for this batch of goods." He pointed to the pile of oak barrels behind him, which were emitting a strong aroma of wine, a total of 121 barrels. But he hesitated and said, "I hope you can pay 20,000 francs in one go. Oh, please understand, we have never cooperated with your caravan, so, generally speaking, the caravan only pays 30% of the payment when purchasing goods, and at most no more than 40%, and the rest will be paid after the sales are completed." And Mary asked for more than 50% at once. Of course, never cooperated is just his excuse. After all, the Minister of Trade and the Governor of Champagne have issued documents to guarantee the credibility of the trade union, and there is basically no situation that makes him feel uneasy. It's just that a large amount of wine has been accumulated recently, causing his funds to bottom out, so he wants to ask for more payment. But he didn't have much hope. If Bond refused, it would be fine. After all, there is no other channel to sell the wine at the moment. Unexpectedly, Bonnet hesitated for a moment, then nodded and said, "To show my sincerity for our first cooperation, I can pay you this much. Of course, the down payment for subsequent transactions will still be restored to the normal level of 30%. Yes, it will still be 30% in the future. You are such a generous gentleman." Mary was overjoyed, and as if afraid that Boner would go back on his word, he dragged him into the office and signed the agreement immediately. Boner also smiled with ease. This was already the third deal he had negotiated today. The boss told him to restore the champagne trade as quickly as possible, and the funds were simply too abundant, which gave him an advantage in negotiating business. In fact, for the trade alliance, these deals are still very cost effective. For example, the high-end wine of Mary Estate usually sells for at least 330 francs per barrel. But due to the recent problems with the trade route, the estate owners have to reduce the price. The trade alliance came in at this time and made a lot of money. A week later, led by Bon and others, more than a dozen carriages of the picket brown caravan of champagne, a member of the French trade union, drove towards Strasbourg. They will enter Baden from there and start selling in the German region for more than a month. At the same time, in a villa in the east of Champagne, François Rivenet stood at the window, looking at the back of the caravan, his face gloomy enough to ooze water. He is the owner of the largest credit and quality caravan in Champagne, which originally occupied nearly 40% of the cargo trade in Champagne. This time, he suspended all the activities of the caravan at the request of Viscount Ford, the major shareholder of the caravan. The latter paid him a compensation of up to 10,000 francs for this matter. At first, he thought he had made a lot of money without his caravan. The estates or workshops in Champagne would not be able to find other channels to sell so many goods. So he only needs to wait for 2 or 3 months, and these businesses will still be his. Even at that time, those people will significantly reduce the price in order to sell the goods earlier, and such signs have begun to appear recently. However, the picket brown caravan that suddenly appeared was like a monster, eating up almost all of Champagne's backlog of goods and set off for Germany today. He couldn't figure out how this small caravan, with assets of no more than 30,000 francs, could come up with so much money to consume nearly half of Champagne's goods. It would take at least 400,000 francs. At this moment, Reven's son knocked on the door in a hurry and frowned at him. "Father, I found out Pickett joined an organization called the French Trade Union and received a large investment as a result." Reven's eyes widened in shock. 400,000 francs. So much? It seems so. Reven immediately fell into a chair powerlessly. If this is the case, then the largest caravan in Champagne is the picket brown caravan. And because of his sudden interruption of trade, he must have ruined his credit in all the manors and workshops. It can be predicted that in future competitions, he will definitely be at a serious disadvantage. Fold. He gritted his teeth and said angrily, "You guys really killed me." In order to earn the 10,000 francs benefit from Ford, he estimated that he would lose more than 50,000 francs in profit this year. His son was stunned for a moment, and then he figured out the whole story. He looked at him hesitantly and said, "Father, should we resume the business?" Reven immediately lowered his head and fell silent. Ford was the largest shareholder of his caravan. If he resumed the caravan now, he would definitely offend him. Chapter 528 Confrontation. While Rivney was struggling internally, he saw the butler arriving with Carberry, the manager of the caravan. As soon as the latter entered the room, he resigned to Reven very simply, citing physical discomfort. Of course, the real reason was that the trade alliance offered too much, and it was difficult for him to refuse. Rivney immediately tried hard to persuade him to stay. Carberry is the main person in charge of the daily affairs of the caravan. If he leaves, it will have an extremely serious impact on the caravan. But Carberry's attitude was very resolute, and he quickly left his resignation letter and walked away. Reven slapped the table and roared for a while, but soon became depressed. Then he looked at his son and shook his head. "We can't ruin the entire caravan for fault. You should contact the people from the trade alliance tomorrow. If possible, we will join in. I will raise some money. If Viscount Ford still insists on his own way, then we will form a new caravan with the veterans of the caravan. If you can't beat it, join." Even a businessman in the 18th century still understood this principle. As was the case with Champagne, caravans across France who participated in the moratorium soon came to regret it. A large number of caravans have chosen to resume business and even seek to join the trade alliance. After all, the market is difficult to get back once it is lost, and currently the trade alliance has firmly occupied a huge market share point. As for those caravanserais that are fully controlled by tax collectors, although they have to stay dormant at a loss under the strict orders of their bosses, this does not affect their employees' large number of job changes. Marseille Point. The sea breeze blows through the busy port with a fishy and salty smell. The early morning sun penetrates the mist and shines on the mountains of goods. At the same time, merchant ships of various sizes are constantly docking, preparing to unload more cargo. Old Fickman pulled the collar of his thin and worn coat to block the chill that kept creeping into his neck. But he was not worried about freezing, because he would soon be busy, and the heavy goods on his shoulders would soon make him sweat profusely. However, as soon as he and several fellow dock workers reached the outside of the dock, they were blocked by a short man with a broad, flat nose and droopy eyes. He recognized the man. He was Hoggart, the steward of Monsieur Philippe Antonel. Antonel controls more than half of the warehouses on the west side of the pier, and is one of the largest forces in Marseille Port. Old Fickman and others hurriedly stepped forward and bowed. "Mr. Hoggart, what can I do for you?" The latter pointed his nostrils at them and said coldly, "Everyone go home. There is no need to go to the dock today." The workers were stunned for a moment, and someone asked anxiously, "Master, what happened? If I don't go to work, my family will have nothing to eat. Give them 15 sous each." Hoggart gestured disdainfully to the men next to him, who immediately took out a handful of copper coins and handed them to Fickman and others. "Stop talking nonsense and go back quickly." "Ah, is this for me?" "Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir." The dock worker saluted repeatedly. Although 15 sous was slightly less than what he could earn as wages, he was naturally happy to get paid without working. Immediately, Hoggart pointed at the man and said, "Don't go to the dock for the past half month. Just come here every day to collect money." Fickman and others thanked them again, and when they were about to turn around and leave, a man wearing a patched burlap coat and shoes stained with mud squeezed in from behind and whispered with a smile. He said, "We might as well go around to the dock from the south and continue working. Wouldn't these 15 sous be earned in vain?" Hoggart immediately had a fierce look on his face, and for a moment he couldn't remember who this person was. He had been living in the port of Marseille for more than 10 years, and there were very few dockworkers he didn't know, but judging from his clothes, he must be the same. He was a hard worker, so he grabbed the man's collar and said fiercely, "Do you want to be beaten? Go back. You don't want to see me angry." The man looked at the copper coins in his hand, but he didn't seem nervous. "You are disturbing the normal order of the dock." Hoggart immediately punched him, but he easily dodged it by turning his head. He committed murder openly. The man broke away from his hand and said to Fickman and the others, "You all saw it." Hoggart was furious and signaled his men to teach the thorny man a lesson, but as soon as he took 2 steps, he froze on the spot in fear. The coon on the opposite side took out a pistol from his waist. Immediately afterwards, several people rushed over from across the street, pushed Hoggart and his men to the ground, and tied them up tightly. The man holding the pistol looked at Fickman and others, smiled and said, "Now, you can go to work. Oh, Gemini Trading Company has a large number of goods arriving at the port these days, and it is said that labor wages will be at least 20% higher than usual." The dock workers looked at each other and tremblingly handed over the money Hoggart had just given them. "Oh master, he insisted on giving us this money. I don't know why he gave me money, since it's a gift from him. Just take it." The man with the gun said, "By the way, I heard that someone recently threatened the workers at the dock not to work, so the Marseille City Hall is going to hire Italians moving cargo." After hearing this, Fickman and others looked at each other with nervous expressions on their faces, and then quickly ran towards the dock. They all carry goods at the dock to make a living. If their jobs are taken away by the Italians, they will probably starve to death. They must show the cargo owners that they are more hardworking and reliable than the Italians. If anyone does not allow them to work at this time, they will definitely fight with that person. And according to this master, they can earn 20% more wages in the next few days, which makes them work harder. Similar situations are happening everywhere in the port of Marseille. A large number of police officers dressed as dock workers attacked everywhere and arrested more than 30 guys who instigated the strike in one day while spreading the news that Italian workers are coming to Marseille. This is the plan discussed by Besançon and Valent, the assistant manager of the twin companies. Besançon originally planned to send a large number of police to surround the port of Marseille to prevent large-scale strikes, but Valent believed that this would only increase the chaos and give the instigators hiding in the dark an opportunity to take advantage point. So he suggested pretending that nothing happened and only letting dozens of police officers mix in with the workers. Those who instigated the strike would definitely meet them as long as they contacted the workers. Combined with some news about Italian workers, this crisis can be effectively resolved. Things developed exactly as he expected. Workers at the port of Marseille soon spread rumors that the port can earn extra wages recently, and Italians are rushing to the docks to grab jobs. For a time, all the dock workers rushed to the docks desperately, determined to drive the Italians out. Even some people who originally did other jobs were attracted by the high wages and came to the docks to try their luck. Soon, several confidants of the tax farmer, including Antonel, were identified by his subordinates and taken away by the police on charges of spreading rumors and undermining the stability of Marseille. The chaos in the port of Marseille, carefully planned by Ford and others, ended almost before it began. Chapter 529 Nobles and Commoners. The second floor of the first French national prison. Guard Captain Xord pushed open the door of cell 211 for the Crown Prince. A faint scent of incense immediately floated out. Joseph glanced at the flat white walls in the cell, the desk with patterns, and the flush toilet behind the half-open toilet door, and couldn't help frowning slightly. This bad habit of French prisons is really difficult to correct. Previously, I told the prison director, Marquis de Launay, that the cells of the nobles should not be too luxurious. He quickly changed the cells into single rooms, but in addition to the single rooms, he actually retained the toilet, dining room and a huge closet. Although the furniture has been reduced a lot compared to before, it is still not cheap and high-end goods in general. This place is much more luxurious and comfortable than the homes of ordinary Parisians. Of course, this condition is several times more difficult for the nobles than before, and living there for a day is torture. However, Joseph also knew that it is difficult to reverse the concept all at once, and he will continue to adjust it in the future. Moreover, he came here today for more important things, and he didn't want to talk to Marquis de Launay about the cell. The man in cell 211 heard the noise and immediately turned to look at the door. When he saw the Crown Prince in a neat blue and white cavalry uniform, he hurriedly took a half step back with his right foot, touched his chest and saluted deeply, and said nervously, "Your Highness, it's great that you can come." Joseph sat down on the chair pulled by Emin, and looked coldly at the middle-aged man in front of him who was still wearing a lace velvet coat and a neat white wig. "Baron Pellier, you can talk now. About the important thing you mentioned." "Yes." This man with an arrogant look in his eyes is one of the giants of the General Association of Tax Farmers, a banker, usurer, and big landowner. Pellier. Just over 10 days ago, his trusted subordinate Antonel was arrested for inciting panic and spreading rumors. Then, the police soon found out several murders committed by Antonel. This guy controlled one of the largest gangs in Marseille port, and he did this a lot, and it was almost known to everyone in Marseille. It was just that he had Pellier's protection before, and the corrupt bureaucracy in Marseille, so no one could do anything to him. However, this time, it was Besançon, the director of the police department, who was in charge in person, and brought an order signed by the Crown Prince himself. Now no one dared to help Antonel get away with it. But unexpectedly, after Antonel was imprisoned, Besançon only threatened him a few times, and he actually gave up his boss behind the scenes. Besançon immediately felt like he had found a treasure. Recently, the tax bureau has been so popular that it has even taken over many jobs that the police bureau should do. After stabilizing the situation in Marseille, he immediately rushed back to Paris and took people to catch the big fish. Pellier, with the order of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince in hand, he dared to arrest even a cabinet minister, not to mention a Chibal. At first, Pellier wanted to resist stubbornly, but soon heard the news that the French trade union appeared and occupied nearly a quarter of the caravan market in France within half a month. and he was immediately like a bereaved mother, and no longer had the confidence and arrogance before. He knew very well that Ford's plan had failed. Now that the crisis of the collapse of the trade route has been eliminated, and the matter of the port of Marseille has been suppressed, the government has no more concerns, and the next step is definitely to deal with himself. But at this juncture, he was sold out by the fool Antonel. So, he decisively decided to learn from Antonel's selling teammates to protect himself. Perrier put on a flattering expression, bowed slightly and said to Joseph, "Your Highness, I did make some very stupid and dishonorable decisions before. I know you must be very angry about it, but I hope that what I tell you later will improve your mood. Of course, if you can give me a little mercy and forgiveness, I will be grateful for your mercy forever." Seeing that Joseph looked impatient, he hurriedly started the topic. "Your Highness, I know who was instigating the intimidation and attacks on the tax bureau across the country." Joseph raised his eyes. "Tell me his name." "It's Bourreau," Perrier said. "Jacques Albert de Bourreau. I know that your people have captured many attackers, but the clues were soon broken. That's because Bourreau sent the men responsible for this matter to Switzerland and Venice, and I happen to have a friend in Switzerland who knows the whereabouts of several of them." He said coincidentally, in fact, as early as when he heard that Bourreau was going to use intimidation to deal with the tax bureau, he had already begun to plan to use this incident to catch the smuggler. Afterwards, by making arrangements in advance in Switzerland, he got hold of the hiding place of Bourreau's men as he wished. He originally planned to use this incident to threaten Bourreau in exchange for a lot of commercial benefits, but he didn't expect to save himself at this time. Joseph's eyes lit up. These capitalists were really ruthless for their own interests. "So, where are they?" Perrier rubbed his hands and smiled. "Your Highness, I hope to be exempted from punishment in exchange for a fine of 2 million francs. Joseph immediately interrupted him. "I can only guarantee that you will not lose your life." Perrier was struck by lightning when he heard this, and the cold sweat on his forehead rolled down his cheeks. A week later, on his way to board a ship to flee to England, Bourreau was stopped by an agent of the intelligence bureau. Then, he met his men who were supposed to have fled to Switzerland in the interrogation room of the prison. Second floor of the Tuileries Palace. Joseph listened to the cheers and discussions coming from outside the window and signaled Emin to close the window. Those were Parisians who were rushing to the Louvre Square to watch the execution ceremony that was about to begin. Today, dozens of millions of tax farmers who were hated by all ordinary people will be beheaded there. Almost all citizens who could spare the time, including farmers within a radius of more than 10 kilometers, came to watch this exciting moment. Baron Breteuil, the Minister of Justice, who was standing in front of Joseph, waited for the noise to be blocked by the glass and immediately continued. "Your Highness, you know, there are many nobles among the prisoners sent to the Louvre Square. At least more than a dozen. It is an insult to the status of nobles to let them be punished together with those lowly prisoners. I'm worried that this will provoke strong protests from the nobles. I mean, this is actually completely avoidable. In France, and even in Europe, the death penalty is completely different for nobles and commoners. This time, due to the combined trial, those ordinary prisoners who should have been hanged were unexpectedly upgraded to enjoy the guillotine treatment of the nobles." Chapter 530 Execution. Because of this, today the nobles who participated in the violent attack on the tax collectors will also go to hell with the ordinary prisoners, whom they usually look down upon. And this will make the nobles feel that this is an insult to them. It sounds very absurd, but in this era, it is really a big deal for the nobles, a big deal about their own identity. "Thank you for your advice." Joseph looked at Baron Breteuil and sighed. Perhaps the nobles should gradually get used to integrating with ordinary people. The superiority of the nobles and their contempt for the common people are not only reflected in luxury and privilege, but have penetrated into every detail of their words, deeds, and thoughts, from accents, eye gestures, to food, accommodation, work, and even cells and death sentences. The nobles have a completely different set of things from the common people. This is already a natural and subconscious behavior, and this will inevitably lead to the division of social classes. Although Joseph also knows that this is a big problem, He knows that this is the most difficult problem to solve point in history. The French Great Revolution had to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives to resolve this problem, and it was repeated several times. Baron Breteuil tried. Your Highness, we can execute these noble prisoners in secret. It won't take too much effort. No need to do that. Joseph waved his hand and looked at the crowd rushing to the execution ground outside the window. I have made arrangements. Today, there will be no distinction between nobles and civilians among those prisoners. They will all be given the same identity. I believe that the nobles will have no objection to the unified execution. In fact, this execution was also an attempt by Joseph, an attempt to gradually eliminate class divisions. As long as people accept the beheading of nobles and commoners at the same place, it will become a routine in the future. Then the prisons of nobles and commoners will converge, and then some living habits will be consistent. Slicing sausages slowly, although inefficient, can minimize social unrest. Joseph was not even sure that his method would work, but it was better than doing nothing. Breteuil wanted to persuade again, but heard the prince say, in fact, not only the criminals in this joint trial, but also the people on the list you just gave me will be executed in the same way. The Minister of Justice was shocked when he heard this. What he had just given His Royal Highness the Crown Prince to sign was a list of tax farmers who had recently been tried, and on that list were great nobles such as Boror and Antinal. He originally thought that His Royal Highness was just expressing his intention and would later seek pardon from Her Majesty the Queen for these people, although the Crown Prince is currently in charge of most judicial work. The power of pardon, which is only for the king, is temporarily held by the Queen. But he did not expect that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince would even execute Boror. You know, in the past great nobles of this status could use fines to atone for their crimes, even if they killed someone in public. This is a tradition and convention. What Joseph hates most is this convention that should have been thrown into the garbage dump of history long ago. He glanced at the clock in the corner, stood up and motioned to Emin to get his coat, and then patted Baron Breteuil on the shoulder. It's almost time. Do you want to go to the Louvre Square with me? The Minister of Justice was stunned for a moment and nodded quickly. Okay, Your Highness. Half an hour later, with the assistance of the prince's personal guards, a large number of police officers finally cleared a passage through the crowds of onlookers, allowing Joseph's carriage to enter the center of the square. It was not because the police in charge of the special passage were negligent, but mainly because the number of onlookers far exceeded their expectations. More than 13,000 people poured into the Louvre Square, which was originally very wide. The square seemed crowded. Although Joseph closed the car window, the cheers and shouts beside him still made his ears buzz. These damn guys are finally going to hell. Thank you, His Royal Highness, for judging these evil tax collectors. Long live His Royal Highness. Long live the High Court. See, His Royal Highness will not let them go. They will have this day too. Haha. Although Joseph was mentally prepared, he was still somewhat shocked by the extent of the people's hatred for the tax farmers. You know, when he returned triumphantly from the southern Netherlands with the guards, there were far fewer people coming to watch. Soon, he was surrounded by officials such as Xode, the president of the High Court, and the supervising judge, and came to the high platform on the north side of the square. It was 3 meters high, allowing him to finally get rid of the crowded sea. He sat down on the chair in the middle and looked across. He saw that in the center of the square, more than 30 meters away, there was a high rectangular wooden platform. On it was a device like a long-handled guillotine, which was completely different from the grand guillotine he had seen in the documentary. It might be a good thing that that kind of guillotine did not appear. Joseph muttered to himself and signaled to the president of the High Court, Duport, who was standing next to him. Please start. Yes, Your Highness. Duport then gave some instructions to his men, and soon, heavy drum beats were heard all around, and the people who came to watch suddenly quieted down. Then, the orchestral instruments also began to play, and the music stopped abruptly after more than 10 minutes. Duport said loudly to the people, "Today, we are honored to welcome the arrival of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Please join me in saluting His Royal Highness." The tens of thousands of people in the square immediately bowed deeply to the VIP seats. Their salute this time was different from the previous ones that were purely forced by the rules. Almost all of them expressed their high respect to the crown prince from the bottom of their hearts. It has long been spread among the people that this tax reform was presided over by His Royal Highness, and it was also under his insistence and promotion that these tax farmers with numerous evil deeds were arrested. How could they not be grateful? Joseph smiled and nodded to everyone, and then went to the front of the stage to make a simple opening speech, and finally announce the start of the execution. A burst of rapid drums immediately came from the square, and a prisoner with his hands tied behind his back walked onto the high platform under the escort of two burly executioners. But what followed was not the court officials reading out the criminal's crimes, but a man dressed as a farmer followed behind them. He seemed a little nervous at first, but when he looked back and saw the tax collector who was about to be executed, he clenched his fists and his body trembled violently with excitement. He completely forgot the speech and process he had practiced repeatedly before, and roared loudly with red eyes, "This bastard, Adrian Burney, he falsely accused me of concealing the land output and asked me to pay a fine of 50 livres. In order to avoid the fine, my sister had to become his mistress. As a result, she died of dystocia caused by him 2 years ago." Chapter 531 Tax Farmer Lavoisier. As the peasant on the execution platform continued to tell the story, more than 10,000 people in the square clenched their fists in anger and gritted their teeth. Especially when he said that after his sister died, the shameless tax farmer forced him to pay the fine of that year, and the amount was as high as 80 livres with interest. The crowd could no longer hold back and burst into a tsunami-like roar. "Execute this devil, kill him, I don't want to wait a moment, let him go to hell." However, the nobles who came to watch were not very excited. The pitiful life of a countryman could only make them shrug their shoulders regretfully, but it was difficult to resonate. Even some guys with bad character, who had done such things as robbing girls from poor families, were still whispering and laughing obscenely. After the peasant finished speaking, the supervising officer took advantage of the atmosphere in the square to reach its peak, read out the verdict of the High Court loudly, and then signaled to start the execution. A drum sounded, and the angry people immediately quieted down, all looking at the tall execution platform. First, the priest came to the tax farmer, made a routine prayer, and asked him to confess. Then, the priest made the sign of the cross and stepped aside. An executioner wearing a black mask, and with arms thicker than an ordinary person's legs, picked up the long-handled guillotine placed aside, and strode to the side of the criminal. Only then did Joseph see that the guillotine was a very large two-handed heavy sword, which was as tall as an adult with the hilt, and flashed a dazzling cold light in the sun. Burney, a tax farmer lying on a crossbeam with his neck caught by the yoke, suddenly became frightened and began to wail loudly, but the next moment, the executioner swung his heavy sword like a windmill. Before everyone could see what was going on, the sword had swept past the yoke, and a column of blood spurted out, and Burney's head rolled to the ground like a fallen coconut. The executioner picked up the head and held it high to show everyone, which immediately attracted deafening cheers. People waved their hands and screamed to their heart's content. The depression, resentment, and unwillingness that had been accumulated in their hearts for a long time were released with the gushing blood. The tax farmer system has been a disaster for the country for too long. Almost everyone has suffered from their murderous hands, and they have taken the last penny from their pockets. They hate them to the bone, but they can do nothing about them. And from the moment this head was chopped off, people knew that the group of tax farmers would no longer exist in the future. The future life is more and more full of hope. Before, the peasant who denounced Burney's crime was now in tears, murmuring his sister's name, and walked down the wooden platform with the help of the executioner's assistant. Then, another tax collector was taken to the execution platform. Just like the previous process, the victim came to the stage first to denounce his crime. However, this time, it was a middle-aged woman who was dressed in old, but neat and decent clothes, and her gestures were quite well educated. She was obviously a noble. She stared at the death row prisoner behind her fiercely, and began to talk about how the latter used the trap of delayed tax payment to gradually make her husband bear heavy debts and eventually had to sell the family business. Even her daughter, who was engaged to a young and handsome lawyer, was divorced because of the family's decline. In the end, their small noble family, that had been passed down for hundreds of years, had to move to the slums of the St. Antoine district. There was foul-smelling sewage everywhere around the house. The husband had to copy documents for more than 10 hours every day to barely make a living. He was overworked and groaned in back pain every night until midnight point this time. Although the common people also shouted execute him, their voices were much smaller than before. After all, the lady's family could at least have enough food. The nobles present were in great anger. These dirty and shameless tax farmers actually used despicable means to persecute a decent and long-standing nobleman into such a miserable situation and into the abyss of suffering. Damn it, they immediately cursed in the most vulgar language like other civilians, waving their arms desperately, and their faces flushed with excitement. After the tax collector was beheaded, the nobles also jumped and cheered without caring about their image. Next, another civilian victim came on stage. In this way, the victims who publicly recounted the crimes of the tax farmers switched back and forth between civilians and nobles. Soon, the onlookers had forgotten their respective identities and began to unanimously denounce the tax farmers as the heads of the criminals were chopped off one by one. The crowd in the square became more united and even began to dance to the drumbeats of the execution. This was Joseph's plan. Let the victims who had been persecuted by the tax farmers for a long time accuse in public, arouse people's sympathy and anger, and directly maximize the rationality of this purge of the tax farmers at this time. No matter whether it was the common people or the nobles, no one would have any sympathy for the tax farmer group. The excited and crazy crowd in the square was proof of this in the future. No matter how he dealt with the Tax Farmers Association, there would definitely not be much resistance. No, it should be said that the cleaner he cleaned up the Tax Farmers Association, the more support he would get from everyone. The execution finally came to an end until dusk, when the two executioners left the scene exhausted. Because it took a lot of time to accuse the tax farmers of their evil deeds, they only chopped off 19 heads that day, and the blood piled up in the corner of the execution platform. Joseph also watched here for a whole day. Fortunately, he had seen more tragic scenes on the battlefield, so he could keep his emotions stable. However, even so, he decided not to participate in the subsequent executions. After all, this primitive execution method was still too bloody. He was not a pervert who would get excited by watching such things. At the current execution speed, heads might be chopped off here for more than half a month. 2 days later, Joseph was looking through the assets of the convicted tax farmers submitted by the tax bureau, as well as the documents on the illegal income that were verified, but suddenly frowned. He suddenly saw a familiar name, Lavoisier. The documents showed that during the more than 10 years, when the great scholar contracted the Paris tobacco tax, he had been diluting the tobacco he handled, thereby obtaining huge illegal profits, about 80,000 to 100,000 livres per year. Joseph couldn't help rubbing his forehead. The historical materials he had seen before said that Lavoisier's beheading by the Jacobins was a huge mistake, which caused French chemical research to stagnate for decades. Now it seems that although his beheading was a bit too heavy a sentence, he was by no means completely innocent. The tax farmer is a big divert, and it is difficult for any person with noble character to keep himself clean once he enters. Chapter 532, His Majesty's Patent. Joseph continued to read the documents about the verdict of the Paris High Court on Lavoisier, and then he breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, 15 years in prison, not directly sentenced to death like the Jacobins. Lavoisier's crime did not meet the standard of beheading. At that time, the French Revolution only had 2 ways of sentencing, not guilty and death penalty, so the father of chemistry lost his life. Joseph weighed the pros and cons. Lavoisier could not go to jail now. The soda ash factory and the coal tar refinery were still waiting for him to preside over the work. If he was put in jail, these projects would have to be stopped. It seems that he can only be granted bail as an exception. Joseph looked at the fine amount of the verdict again, which was as high as 1.2 million francs. He frowned immediately. After the fine was paid, Lavoisier probably would not be able to come up with enough bail. In this case, he could only ask his father to grant him a special pardon. This great scholar has a family fortune of more than 1 million. Why would he be greedy for a little more? At this moment, Emin whispered outside the door, "Your Highness, Baron Breteuil wants to see you. Please, let him in." Then, The Minister of Justice pushed the door open, followed by a middle-aged man wearing glasses. After the salute, Bretteville gestured to the man who came with him and introduced Joseph. "Your Highness, this is Joseph Ignace Guillotin of the Paris Judicial Prosecutor's Office. In fact, he has always been committed to improving the efficiency of execution. After his unremitting efforts, he finally invented this new type of guillotine." Hearing this, Guillotin hurriedly stepped forward, opened the box he carried with him, took out an exquisite guillotine model from it, and smiled and explained to Joseph attentively, "Your Highness, our current beheading is very troublesome and inefficient, and the criminals will suffer a lot. At the same time, the executioner's salary is also very high, even close to the municipal commissioner. So, I found a German craftsman who had experience in this area, and invented this guillotine with him. Oh, these days, a large number of beheadings are being carried out in the Louvre Square, and this new machine can be used. It can increase the efficiency of execution several times. Please, allow me to show you how it works." Joseph looked at the door-shaped frame on the table, with a sharp blade hanging in the middle of the guillotine, and sighed in his heart that the inertia of history was really stubborn, and what was supposed to come had come. However, he remembered that in history, Guillotin presented this new invention to Louis XVI, but he didn't expect that it would be sent to him in this life. This is understandable. After all, Baron Bretteville was promoted by himself, and the entire judicial system was under his management. The judicial system has an epoch-making invention, so it naturally comes to him first. Yes, in this era when beheadings all over the world rely on executioners and knives, a fully automatic guillotine is simply equivalent to the invention of high-precision CNC machine tools in later generations, and it is an epoch-making high-precision technology. You have to ask for credit from the big boss. Guillotin had already skillfully lifted the blade on the model and placed a cucumber on the gap of the wooden yoke to simulate a human head. Then, he pulled the wrench on the model, and the blade fell down and cut the cucumber with a click. However, embarrassingly, the blade got stuck in the cucumber at 2/3 of the cucumber and failed to cut it. Guillotin wiped his sweat, hurriedly pulled up the blade again, and smiled at Joseph. "Your Highness, it's just a little accident. Please give me another chance." Joseph glanced at the blade, which was flat and obviously a version that had not been improved. It was not surprising that it would get stuck. He was about to propose an improvement plan for the classic oblique blade to complete the Dajamming style guillotine, but he was suddenly stunned when the word came to his lips, "Let's give this opportunity to show up to my father. After all, it was originally his patent, and it can also increase my father's sense of participation. In governing the country there are not many opportunities for him to participate, so don't grab it yourself." So, he said to Guillotin, "His Majesty has a unique research on mechanical equipment. Perhaps he can give you some useful suggestions for your machine. It's just right to ask Dad for a pardon from Lavoisier." More than an hour later, Louis XVI looked at the guillotine model, rubbed his chin and thought for a long time, and suddenly grabbed a pen and paper and started writing and drawing. After several revisions, a drawing of an oblique guillotine appeared in front of Guillotin. The latter was immediately shocked and flattered and complimented His Majesty the King. In fact, it can't be regarded as flattery. He really admired His Majesty the King. This is equivalent to a big cow in the future who saw a high-precision CNC lathe for the first time and directly modified a new generation of version for you. You can't refuse to accept it. Guillotin also received a grant of 50,000 francs from Louis XVI to manufacture several prototypes of the improved guillotine. Bretteville immediately said that the prototype could be taken to the Louvre Square for testing. After the Minister of Justice and Guillotin left excitedly, Louis XVI started chatting with his son, whom he hadn't seen for a while. "Joseph, I heard that you have arrested many illegal tax farmers recently." "Yes, father." Joseph was a little surprised that his father, who spent all day in the workshop, still paid attention to current affairs. "These guys are unforgivable and seriously endanger the development and stability of France. You can tell how many bad things they have done from how excited the crowd was when they were beheaded." He originally thought that Louis XVI wanted to intercede for those big tax collectors. After all, he was a soft-hearted man. If a tax collector could ask for help from him, he would probably find it hard to refuse. Unexpectedly, Louis XVI patted him on the shoulder hard and said with a very proud expression, "My Joseph has grown up." He presided over such a big thing as the tax reform and dealt with the evil tax collectors. He really made outstanding contributions to the country and the people. I bet that there is no crown prince in the whole of Europe who can better than you. You are so proud of me and your mother. Although he is not good at handling government affairs and is quite playful, it does not prove that he is a fool. On the contrary, he is very smart. Whether what his son does is beneficial to the country, he can understand it with just a little thought. He paused and then continued, "Well, my improved guillotine can help you deal with those villains more effectively, so I also contributed to this tax reform." Joseph smiled quickly and said, "Yes, your invention is of great significance." He secretly thought in his heart that it might not play such a big role in history. After talking about the abolition of the tax farming system for a while, Louis XVI suddenly remembered something, pulled Joseph towards his workshop, and said excitedly, "I have made a sample of the rifled gun you mentioned before. Now, you can always tell me how to double its rate of fire, right? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels." Chapter 533, The Hunter's Artifact. In the luxurious royal workshops of the Palace of Versailles, Louis XVI took down a rifle that looked like Charleville 1776 from the wooden rack on the wall, handed it to his son, and said with emotion, "You see, the processing is really difficult. It's like installing a dozen clocks in the barrel. This thing took me nearly a year, but I bet that no one in Europe can make it so quickly. There must be no more than 3 people who come up with it." Joseph thought to himself, if it weren't for the birdcage hair ornament you bought for mom as a birthday gift, it would have been completed in early October. He carefully took the gun and squinted into the barrel. He saw 4 uneven spiral lines neatly arranged on the inner wall of the barrel. Dad's craftsmanship is indeed as superb as ever. You should know that at the end of the 18th century, this kind of rifling was done by hand using a long hook knife fixed on a slightly inclined stand and pulled out bit by bit. The manufacturing process relies entirely on feel. If the distance between the 2 spirals is even slightly off, the entire barrel will be scrapped. Therefore, only veteran craftsmen with more than 10 years of experience dare to take over this kind of work. As a result, the cost of rifled guns is more than 10 times that of ordinary flintlock guns, and the production cycle is extremely long. But in order to keep the research and development process confidential, Joseph could only leave the production of the new gun to his father. And His Majesty the King has indeed lived up to his reputation as France's #1 craftsman. Starting from a novice, he produced this brand new rifled gun in less than a year. "You really have the most dexterous hands in France, my dear father, and the most brilliant mind." Louis XVI suddenly laughed happily, then pointed at the new gun and looked at Joseph expectantly. "So, how can it greatly increase the rate of fire? Use that iron cone you added to its medicine chamber." Joseph smiled mysteriously, picked up the vernier caliper next to him, and measured the size of the gun muzzle, and said to the craftsman standing at the door, "Mr. Merrick, please help me make a cylinder with a diameter of 17.8mm and a length of 35mm from lead, with a hemispherical head, as you wish, your highness." Louis XVI was a little surprised. "What do you do with making lead pillars? Make bullets?" Joseph looked at the various muskets hanging on the wall and asked, "Father, are there any rifled guns here?" "Of course." Louis XVI gestured to his side. "These are all my collections. A rifled gun modified from model 1763 by the chief craftsman of the Charleville factory. Look, that's the Bavarian Augsburg 1720. It has 8 riflings. There are also weird things invented by the Englishman Sir Alex Ferguson. I bought them from a smuggler for £1,000. You can really have a weapons show here," Joseph said, taking off the German rifle. There was huge demand from wealthy hunters in Germany, which produced some of the best rifled guns in Europe. For example, this Type 1720 has a caliber of only 15mm, but its range and accuracy can surpass the British and French .72, which is an 18mm flintlock gun. Of course, the price is that the cost is prohibitively high and maintenance is difficult. Joseph picked up another spherical lead bullet from the single bag next to him and gestured to his father. Besides the difficulty in producing the rifled gun, the biggest drawback is that loading is time consuming and laborious. Louis XVI nodded. In order for the projectile to rotate under the action of the rifling, the outer edge must be embedded in the rifling. Therefore, choose a projectile diameter that is slightly larger than the barrel diameter, and then use a hammer and iron fiber to knock the projectile into the gun chamber. The diameter of the powder chamber on the bottom plate of the gun chamber is smaller than that of the barrel, and the projectile cannot be knocked after it hits the bottom. Joseph put down the 16mm diameter projectile in his hand and picked up the ordinary musket projectile beside him. If you could use subcaliber projectiles, the rate of fire of a rifled gun could be at least doubled. The so-called subcaliber refers to projectiles whose diameter is smaller than the diameter of the barrel. On the contrary, projectiles with larger diameters are called supercaliber. Louis XVI shook his head and said, but in that case, the projectile cannot be embedded in the rifling and cannot produce rotation. Joseph smiled slightly. We can change our thinking. For example, after loading the subcaliber projectile into the gun chamber, we can make it larger. How is this possible? Louis XVI said it was impossible, but his eyes were full of expectation. His son had shown him miracles many times. The easiest thing to do is this. Joseph stuffed the subcaliber projectile into the muzzle of the Augsburg 1720 gun, then hit it hard with a hammer and iron fiber loaded with supercaliber projectiles. He looked at his father and said, look, the diameter of the projectile is smaller than that of the gun. It's up to you. Louis XVI was amused. If you flatten the projectile, it will seriously affect the range and accuracy. Indeed. Joseph nodded. But you have to admit, this projectile will definitely spin when it is fired. Before his father could object, he immediately added, so we can design the projectile into a cylinder so that it won't flatten after being hit a few times. But that won't make the projectile fit into the rifling. It's time to use the iron cone you installed. Louis XVI was startled when he heard this, and his eyes lit up immediately. I understand. When struck hard, the iron cone at the bottom of the gun chamber will penetrate into the bottom of the cylindrical bullet, expanding the diameter there. When firing, the tail of the bullet embeds itself into the rifling, creating a spiral. That's right. Joseph nodded vigorously and winked at his father. This is a Dauphin, August 1790 rifle. It will completely change the status of the chasseurs and affect the battlefields of Europe. He almost blurted out the name of this weapon. Originally, the Dauphin rifle was a groundbreaking weapon that was equipped in large quantities by the French chasseurs in the 19th century and copied by Prussia, Belgium, Bavaria and other countries. In fact, Joseph originally planned to let his father develop the Mini A bullet directly, which was the pinnacle of muzzle-loading rifles and had more advantages than the Dauphin rifle. However, he only remembered the principle of the Mini A bullet and the specific projectile structure, as well as the width and depth of the bottom opening, needed to be designed by his father and repeatedly verified, and the gun body structure needed to be adjusted to match. This may take a long time to complete. So, after weighing the pros and cons, he chose the Dauphin rifle, which was less difficult to develop. The bullet of this gun is a simple cylinder, and illiterate soldiers can make it in the field with a mold. Moreover, it can be produced by using existing rifle technology and making some minor changes. Just add a long iron cone in the chamber. Of course, even if it is a minor change, it will take a lot of trial production for Dad to finalize the specific process. Chapter 534 Weapons that subvert the battlefield model. Compared with the mine rifle, the Thuvinant rifle requires 2 more clicks when loading, resulting in a slightly slower reloading speed, but the difference is minimal. In addition to the difficulty of research and development, the current level of technology and logistics capabilities are also more suitable for Tawenan rifles. The irregular shape of the mini bullet requires very high processing accuracy, so it can only be produced in the rear factory and then transported to the front. This will undoubtedly increase logistical pressure. Tawenan's lead bullets can be melted and cast when given to frontline soldiers. The current flintlock bullets are made using this model, so the army's logistics supplies will only contain gunpowder, but no projectiles at all. As for the long-term goal, Joseph even wanted to skip the mine-rifled gun directly. He glanced at the Ferguson 1776 breech-loading rifle on the wall. Although this gun was widely ridiculed in the UK and was not taken seriously for half a century, he knew very well that that was the future development direction of rifles. The Ferguson 1776 was very creative. It loaded ammunition from the back of the barrel and then used an upright iron block to close the barrel. It is the world's first breech-loading rifle put into actual combat. The rate of fire of this gun reaches a terrifying 6 rounds per minute. In comparison, the best flintlock shooters can only fire 4 rounds per minute, and the average soldier can fire 3 rounds to be considered qualified. And the biggest advantage of breech-loading guns is not the rate of fire, but that they can shoot while lying down. For muzzle-loading guns, the gun must be stood up before ammunition can be loaded into the barrel, so the shooter has to stand all the time. Then you can complete the process by lying down while loading the gun. It is conceivable that when 2 armies are facing each other, if one side stands upright and the other side lies down and shoots, the former will definitely be massacred. In fact, the Ferguson 1776 rifle was installed in the British Army during the American Revolutionary War, and the American Chasseur Company commanded by Ferguson himself achieved good results on the battlefield. But in the end he himself died in battle in North America, and this gun became silent. Of course, the core reason why this gun has not received much attention is technical factors: poor vertical bolt design and rough processing level, which caused serious air leakage in the barrel. After Ferguson died, no one continued to improve it. It was not until 1819 that the American Hall developed the first relatively reliable breech-loading gun, but it still used a flint firing method, which made it not very practical. In 1841, the Prussian dresser invented the flash-cap-fired breech-loading rifle and helped Austria win the Prussian-Danish War within a week, finally vindicating the name of the breech-loading rifle. Since then, muzzle-loading guns have gradually withdrawn from the stage of history, and breech-loading guns have begun to dominate the battlefield. Joseph's plan was to first use the Thuvinant rifle to create a mature rifled gun production system in France, and then let his father slowly develop breech-loading guns. As long as it is successfully developed and equipped with troops, it will not be a dream for 10,000 French troops to defeat any 50,000 European troops. Moreover, he is very clear about the technological development direction of breech-loading guns: rotating bolt, high-strength firing pin, paper-cased fixed-loading ammunition, plus the flash cap firing that the French army has already equipped in large quantities. There is no need to detour at all the historical research and development process for decades. In the first craftsman of France under the auspices of the company, it is likely to be produced in just 10 years, or even less. Over there, Louis XVI's assistant Aymeric came over with a dozen cylindrical bullets that had just been poured. Louis XVI took the bullet, immediately put the fresh rifled gun on his back happily, and took his son, and rushed towards the Royal Ordnance Factory next to the Palace of Versailles. On the shooting range of the Royal Ordnance Factory, Joseph loaded the ammunition into the August 1790, pounded it hard with an iron rod a few times, pulled the trigger, inserted a copper flash cap, and completed the loading. The time consumption is almost the same as that of an ordinary flintlock gun. After testing it several times on a fixed wooden frame, and feeling that there was no risk of exploding the barrel, Louis XVI ignored the dissuasion of the guards, and picked up the new gun himself, squinting at the wooden target in the distance. After a loud bang, the staff at the shooting range cheered, picked up the target and ran over. Everyone present looked shocked when they saw the bullet holes in the target point 100 paces away. The bullet accurately hit the center of the wooden target point for a flintlock gun that relies entirely on faith to hit a target from 40 steps away. This is simply a crushing level of transcendence point in several subsequent test firings. The August 1790 even directly hit a wooden target 140 steps away, demonstrating the terrifying accuracy of the rifled gun point. Louis XVI excitedly patted Joseph on the back and shouted loudly, "My dear son, we have once again stood at the pinnacle of European musketry. I really look forward to the moment when the enemy is defeated by the warriors of France, and I tremble to ask, what weapons did you use? It's so powerful, they will get the answer." The August 1790 type, developed by our great king himself, Joseph said with great approval, and then the father and son looked at each other and laughed happily together. When his father calmed down, Joseph leaned into his ear and said, "Dear father, do you want to create another gun that can subvert the battlefield pattern in Europe?" "Oh, God, how many fantastic ideas do you have in your head?" Louis XVI looked at his son in shock. "What kind of gun is that?" Joseph smiled slightly. "A brand new breech loading gun." After Joseph arranged the production plan of August 1790 to the Royal Armoury, he returned to the Royal Workshop and told his father about the design ideas of the breech-loading rifle point. It was not until the king's attendant came to remind the father and son that it was time to rest that Joseph realized it was already 11 o'clock in the evening. He tiredly put down the sketch in his hand, agreed with his father to continue discussing the technical plan tomorrow morning, and yawned and returned to his bedroom. The maid Camelia had been waiting at the door for a long time. Seeing His Royal Highness coming back, she hurriedly greeted him and knelt down. "Your Highness, do you want to rest directly or have some supper first? I have prepared nut puff pastry and fruit tea for you." "Oh, then have something to eat. Thank you very much." Joseph looked at her and was slightly startled. The girl in front of him was wearing a black and white maid outfit. Yes, the kind of puff sleeves, lace collar, butterfly waist, lace hem, black long skirt, and white stockings. With her violet eyes, bright and full lips, white and tender skin, and a chest that is about to burst out, she is just like the embodiment of a beautiful girl in the second dimension. What is this?" Camelia bit her lip and whispered, "Your Highness, I asked Mr. Candace to make me a set according to the uniform you mentioned last month. Do you think it is inappropriate?" "Well, it's very beautiful and suits you well." Joseph thought to himself, "I just mentioned it casually at the time, and you really made it." "No, Baron Candace seems to be the chief designer of fashion for the Queen. How much did you pay him to make it?" Chapter 535 Camelia's professional craftsmanship. If Joseph knew that Camelia's maid outfit was worth 2,300 francs, he would definitely shout spendthrift girl. However, the maid inherited 50,000 francs from her grandmother, plus the huge compensation that Joseph helped her get from Baron Walter. She is now a little rich woman and can really afford this little money. In fact, the tuition she paid to learn advanced experience from the ladies of the Palace of Versailles is much more expensive than this dress. Camelia looked at the prince, who was tasting the snacks she made, and quickly went over the plan for tonight in her mind. Since the failure of the last action, she has been lying on straw and tasting gall and made more careful preparations. Today, she finally got the chance. Dr. Perna's mother has a birthday tomorrow, so she will leave the Palace of Versailles for 2 days, which eliminates the biggest obstacle. Today, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince happened to be back in the palace to rest, which was a perfect opportunity to take action. Joseph finished his supper, stretched tiredly, and was about to wash up when he saw Camelia kneeling slightly beside him and whispered, "Your Highness, you have been busy all day. You must be very tired, right?" "Ah, it is indeed a little tired." The maid showed a sweet smile. "Your Highness, I recently learned massage from Mrs. Mawson." "Oh, they call it noble sports, which is very effective in relieving fatigue and relaxing the mind." Perhaps I can try it for you to help you get rid of fatigue. Well, this set of massage techniques originated from the Roman era according to Mrs. Mawson, but she spent a full 3,000 francs to learn it, just to be able to use it at this moment. Joseph rubbed his sore shoulders and thought, I didn't expect this little girl to know everything. She is simply the chosen maid body. So, he smiled and nodded. You are really versatile. Then I will trouble you. Camellia was secretly happy in her heart. Her new tactics successfully took the first step. Mrs. Sells promised her that, as long as the massage started, the prince would be hers. Her cheeks flushed instantly, and she stopped her reverie, and pushed a special bed in with the maid point. Joseph saw the round hole on the head of the bed and immediately realized that it was a massage bed. It seemed very professional, and he immediately looked forward to Camellia's skills. It seems that he will have a professional masseur in the future, and she is a little beauty wearing a maid outfit, and with a proud figure. Well, he has been busy and working hard for France for the past few years, and now he can finally enjoy the good life that the prince should have. Point. He took off his coat and handed it to the maid next to him. At Camellia's signal, he lay face down on the massage bed. His face was embedded in the round hole, allowing his nose to breathe smoothly. Then, he closed his eyes and prepared to enjoy a comfortable massage. Camellia also looked very professional. She took out a pack of massage tools and winked at the maids. The maids immediately dispersed. Some lit the fireplace, some lit incense, and some dimmed the lights and covered them with a pink glass cover. Then they all left the house. They all received a huge bribe from Camellia's maids, so they were naturally very cooperative. The soft pink light filled the whole room. The fire made the air warm, with the fragrance blowing. Joseph felt a pair of soft and delicate hands on his back. He was so comfortable that he almost fell asleep before the massage started. At the end of a corridor in the south hall of the Palace of Versailles, Sorrel avoided the patrolling guards, hid in the shadows, and quickly took off her long skirt, revealing the black tight hunting suit inside. She looked around to make sure there was no one, and then slipped into a room next to the prince's bedroom. She walked lightly past the bedroom of the sleeping noble family and subconsciously pressed the stack of banknotes in her pocket. That was a full 5,000 francs. She worked hard for more than a year and earned 3,500 francs. Plus the income from the small mulberry garden left to her by her mother, to make up the money. In the previous fencing competition, because of her childish arrogance, she caused His Royal Highness the Dauphin to lose 5,000 livres. At least she always thought so. As a responsible lady, she must compensate His Royal Highness. At first, she expected to collect enough money by early summer this year, but she unexpectedly received several commissions from the tax bureau a while ago, to go to the homes of some shameless tax farmers, to take their criminal evidence, and thus received a commission of nearly 1,000 francs. Well, after seeing the various evil deeds of the tax farmers, Robespierre determined that these guys must be completely eliminated in order for the French people to survive. Therefore, for some tax farmers whose crimes were not serious enough to be executed, he hired professionals to obtain evidence of their crimes by special means, and finally successfully added nearly 60 people to the death penalty list. Sorel originally wanted to return the 5,000 francs directly to the prince, but then thought that with his kindness and mercy, he would probably not accept the money. In the end, she decided to quietly put the money in the prince's bedroom and not give him a chance to refuse. In the middle of the night, a black figure like a civet cat climbed up the window and then moved along the wall very lightly, accurately avoiding the sight of the patrolling guards in the courtyard. When Sorel climbed to the window of the prince's bedroom and looked inside, he saw a faint pink halo through the gap of the curtains and was surprised. Could it be that His Highness was still awake? She bit her lip, lowered her hood a little, and was not ready to retreat. She was confident in her skills, and even if he was not asleep, she could still send the money in. However, what she didn't notice was that the window on the left side of the prince's room was pushed open a crack, and the captain of the prince's guard, Exode, was staring at her back and was in a dilemma. Since Sorel entered the noble's room, he found her, but he also recognized who it was in his memory. This little girl appeared beside His Highness many times, and it seemed the two were quite close. So, she went to His Highness's residence alone late at night, probably to cough. If I rushed forward To stop her at this time, I might ruin his highness's good thing. But if she was going to do something bad, if he let it go, it would be a big problem. He shook his head, signaling the guards and servants not to make a sound, and he quietly pushed the door of his highness open a crack with his hand on the sword, listening vigilantly to the movement inside. On the other side, Sorrel also skillfully opened the window buckle and jumped into the room without disturbing anyone. At this moment, the sleepy Joseph suddenly widened his eyes and let out a shrill scream. Chapter 536 The Crown Prince's Mistresses. Joseph, who was originally waiting to enjoy it, found that he had misjudged the explosive power of the delicate hands behind him, and the massage skills of the owner of the hands. Camellia couldn't hit the spot every time, and her fingers repeatedly landed on the joints of tendons, accompanied by technical movements such as rotating and pulling, plus the strength she had gained from cleaning and carrying soup pots every day. After a few moves, the pain was so painful that Joseph burst into tears. Stop, stop. Joseph cried loudly. I want to die. I want to die. All he wants to say now is I'll do it. I'll do it all. Sorrel, who had just entered the house, was startled when she heard the screams. She quickly looked through the dim light and saw a woman pressing the crown prince on the long table with one hand against his neck and the other. He was holding a dark object in one hand and seemed to be about to smash it down. When the crown prince shouted, I'm going to die, she was immediately shocked. This was an assassination attempt. Fortunately, I bumped into him, and the opportunity to make up for his highness came. She didn't have time to draw her sword, so she jumped to the massage bed, raised her foot, and kicked the female assassin away. When Kessoud outside the house heard the crown prince's shout, his heart sank. He rushed into the house with his sword in hand. He saw Sorrel, whose face was covered by a hood, kicking Miss Camellia away, and was holding a knife in her hand. Draw your sword, damn it. Is she planning an assassination attempt? The guard captain didn't have time to think too much. He jumped forward and struck Sorrel with his sword, carrying the sound of wind. The latter's sword had just been drawn out, and before he could stab the female assassin, he caught a glimpse of cold light from the corner of his eye and hurriedly raised his sword to block it. There was a crisp sound of dang. Kessoud's powerful and heavy sword knocked the lady's swift sword away. Then he lowered his arm and the tip of the sword was already touching the chest of the assassin. Joseph heard Camelia's groan, rubbed his almost crushed shoulders, turned over and sat up, and immediately saw the guard captain and a man in black fighting swords beside him. Seeing the crown prince stand up, Sorrel and Kessoud turned around and said loudly to him, Your Highness, be careful of assassins. Camellia also struggled to hold herself up, looked at the crown prince, and said anxiously, Your Highness, leave quickly. There are assassins. The three of them shouted and looked at each other in surprise, wondering why the assassin would blow himself up. Immediately afterwards, more than a dozen of the crown prince's personal guards poured in and raised their guns to surround the few people in the room. And then someone turned on the gas lamp. Only then did Joseph see clearly the pretty face under the hood, and said unexpectedly, Sorrel, is that you? How did you get in? Sorrel glanced at the maid on the side and said anxiously, Your Highness, she just wanted to assassinate you. I came to save you. Joseph looked at Camellia again, who was clutching her shoulder and pale in pain. Are you okay? She was a bit harsh just now, but it wasn't to the point of assassination. After more than 10 minutes, the crown prince's personal guards all retreated, and Kessoud stared at Sorrel with a straight face. Miss Stalker lowered her head with shame on her face and pushed the 5,000 francs in front of Joseph. Your Highness, I'm really just here to pay back the money. I was worried that you wouldn't accept it, so after she explained, she looked at Camellia, who was applying medicine to her shoulder with the help of the maid, with tears in her eyes, and bowed apologetically. I'm really sorry, this distinguished lady. It's all my fault. I will compensate you for your medical expenses, and please forgive me. After Joseph confirmed to the imperial doctor that Camellia was only injured and not serious, he breathed a sigh of relief, then picked up the large pile of banknotes and handed it back to Sorrel. You made a mistake. In fact, I only bet you 10 livres that time. Well, don't get me wrong. It's not that I didn't have confidence in you at the time. I just didn't like gambling. 10 livres? Exclamation mark. Sorrel was stunned for a moment, and his face turned red and white. He looked at the 5,000 francs in his hand, and recalled that he was sure that the crown prince would bet heavily on him to win. He was so embarrassed that he wanted to dig out the Palace of Versailles with his toes. Joseph breathed a sigh of relief, feeling even more exhausted from being tormented by the two beauties, so he said to Kessoud, "It's too late. Please send Miss Frizzy back." Frizzy is Sorrel's last name. "Yes, your highness." Sorrel thought for a while, put the money on the table again, and whispered, "Your highness, thank you for your tolerance. Let this money be regarded as compensation for disturbing your rest." Joseph was naturally unwilling to accept it. The two declined, and Joseph said helplessly, "Let's do this. I will invest the money in the king's fund in your name. You can receive dividends every year." It has almost become his instinct to improve the poor French finances, even if it is mosquito legs. Sorrel nodded, then gave a flustered salute, and then ran towards the door as if running away. 2 days later at Lavoisier's home, Lavoisier's wife Marion was wiping away tears and whispering to her best friend Perna, "It's all because Antoine was blinded by the devil and did those disgraceful things. Alas, he blames himself very much now and keeps repenting every day." After being sentenced to 15 years in prison by the High Court, Lavoisier was also frightened. He wanted to go to the crown prince to plead for mercy, but he was afraid that he would be reprimanded by his highness. After all, his highness presided over this tax reform, and he was doing it for him. He broke things off. Fortunately, he listened to his highness's advice and stopped the tax farming business 2 years ago. Otherwise he would have been sentenced even more severely this time. So he asked his wife to find Dr. Perna, who was beside the crown prince, and asked her to help him speak for him. He naturally didn't know that Joseph had actually decided to ask the king for a pardon for him. Perna comforted Marion softly, "You must pay the fine as soon as possible, and I will definitely ask his highness to help you. Oh, maybe you will need a bail. Thank you so much, my dear Perna. Only you can save Antoine now." Madame Lavoisier pulled Perna and cried again. The two besties chatted until the afternoon. After getting Perna's repeated assurances, Marion finally breathed a sigh of relief, and then she began to care about her bestie again. "By the way, have you heard about the crown prince's mistress?" "Mistress?" The female doctor's heart tightened immediately. "I heard it was a wild girl named Sorrel and his highness's maid." Marion obviously knew her bestie's feelings for the crown prince, and said earnestly, "It's rumored in Versailles that the two of them got into a fight the night before yesterday over his highness's jealousy. The maid was injured, and the royal guards were dispatched to stop them." "My dear, maybe you should be more cautious. Don't forget, you were the first one to accompany the crown prince. Well, you should show the momentum of the chief mistress and let them know the rules." Cough cough cough. Perna was so shocked that she coughed repeatedly, and her cheeks instantly turned red. It was the first time she heard someone call her his highness's mistress, and the chief. However, a strong sense of sweetness surged in her heart. She knew very well that it was impossible for her to marry his highness the crown prince with her background, so she had been trying hard to suppress this feeling in her heart, just wanting to stay with his highness as much as possible and be satisfied with watching him silently. And today, Mariana's words suddenly gave her new hope. Yes, even if she can't marry his highness, if she becomes his mistress, can't she be by his side for the rest of her life? Oh god, what am I thinking? It's so embarrassing. Chapter 537 Joseph's Vocational College. Perna's eyes met Mariana's smiling eyes, and she immediately stood up suddenly, her cheeks redder, and she shook her head repeatedly with a look of shame and anger. I don't understand what you are talking about. I don't have it. I'm not his highness's lover. Ahem. Yes, I know." Mariana smiled even brighter, stepped forward to hug her flustered best friend, and said softly, "My dear, you are so beautiful, and have a soul full of knowledge. No one can resist it. Your charm." "Mariana, I think I have to go." Like a child caught stealing candy, Perna stepped back and saluted, then stammered, I will go find his highness and tell Lavoisier regarding the baron. This must be done as soon as possible." Mariana thanked her repeatedly and put the gift she was going to give to the crown prince into her hand. Then she watched her run into the carriage quickly, smiled again, waved to her back and said, Perna, change into that men's clothing, it's drowning your beauty. Well, Perna huddled in the carriage, her heart pounding. She felt sweet and sour, and words like chief mistress flashed through her mind from time to time. After a while, she suddenly remembered Mariana's last words, and couldn't help but look down at the dark grey men's clothes on her body. After hesitating for a few seconds, she nodded vigorously, as if she had made up her mind. Southeast side of the Palace of Versailles in the Royal Ordnance Factory, Joseph looked helplessly at technician supervisor Garman. In other words, there are only 2 technicians in the entire ordnance factory who are proficient in rifling technology. Indeed, Your Highness. Garman lowered his head and said, even in Charleville, there are only 6 or 7 technicians who know this. You know, this is a very delicate and complicated skill, and it is rarely used. Joseph sighed and said, then train them immediately. How long will it take to train 100 rifling technicians? This. Garman hesitated. It depends on the talent of the apprentice, Your Highness. A master can usually teach 3 apprentices. If he learns quickly, the apprentice can graduate in 2 years, and after another half a year of practice, he can process alone. So long? Joseph calculated in his mind that according to the quick learner standard, it would take 5 years to recruit 100 rifling technicians. Garman glanced nervously at Louis XVI, who was looking at the drawings next to him, and whispered, His Majesty the King took more than 9 months of study to master it. Joseph was relieved. The top craftsmen in France have to learn it for 9 months, which shows that this technology is indeed not easy. The rifling operation in this era was done purely by hand, using a hook knife to carve 4 spiral lines of the same width and exactly the same interval on the inner wall of an iron pipe with a diameter of more than 10 mm and a length of 1 meter, with a slight offset of 0.1 mm in the middle. It would have to be scrapped and redone, and only the top craftsmen could complete it. Joseph immediately felt that something was wrong. There were also talented craftsmen in France. Even if they were not as good as his father, they would not be so many times worse. So he looked at the technician supervisor and asked, why do other apprentices take so much longer than Your Majesty? Well, of course, it's mainly because of His Majesty's extraordinary talent. Garman said. In addition, Mr. Lalossel has been guiding His Majesty step by step. Normally speaking, whether it is the ordnance factory or the technicians in Charleville, they can only spend 2 hours a day teaching apprentices, and they have to divide it among 3 people. 2 hours? Joseph asked in surprise. Why do you only have so little time, Your Highness? The technicians have their own work to do, and that is the source of their salary. Garman explained patiently, so the craftsmen are generally only willing to bring 1 apprentice, and usually they only let the apprentice watch and figure it out by themselves. It is difficult to get advice even once every few days, so, in the past, it took 5 to 10 years for an apprentice to graduate. With your instructions this time, it can be shortened to 2 years, which is relatively fast. Joseph couldn't help but rub his forehead. The apprenticeship system in this era is really bad. How can it keep up with the needs of industrialization in terms of its efficiency in cultivating talents? He thought for a while and continued, then, let the technician spend all his time teaching the apprentices, and not doing anything else, and I will pay them a salary. Will it be faster? Garman spread his hands and said, Your Highness, I'm afraid that even if they agree, they will do it privately. After all, they have to keep their skills. Otherwise by the time they finish teaching the apprentices, they may no longer be the top batch in the industry. Joseph nodded silently upon hearing this. So the root of all problems lies in the training mechanism. For those craftsmen, their own work always comes first, and teaching apprentices is just to have someone to help them. Tuition fees in this era were extremely meager, and they basically looked down upon them. Therefore, if we want to solve the problem of cultivating industrial talents, we must introduce a vocational technician training system. Let the craftsmen who teach skills be completely out of work and become professional teachers, and the number of students they train will be used as a basis for remuneration. Taking this training of rifling technicians as An opportunity to establish a number of vocational colleges. This will play a huge supporting role in France's industrial revolution. You must know that the contribution of a professional and technical craftsman to industrial development can sometimes exceed that of hundreds of ordinary workers who only repeat work. Vocational colleges allow France to acquire such talents several times faster than other European countries. In later generations, Germany was supported by a large number of skilled workers to build advanced manufacturing industries. Vocational education was even called the secret weapon of Germany's industrial takeoff, which shows how important it is. Joseph immediately signaled to Emin, who was standing at the door. Please inform Count Mirabeau, Mr. Gensonnet, and Archbishop Beaumont. He paused when he said this. Although the French education system has always been managed by the church, he always felt that it was a bit inappropriate to let priests preside over the construction of industrial colleges in the future. The education system, at least vocational high schools and universities, will be separated from the church, and they will be allowed to do literacy education in local parishes. And Mr. Dinoco, come to me tomorrow morning. Yes, Your Highness. Joseph turned to Garmin on the side. You and Manager Martinier should come together. The Industry Department, Education Department, Propaganda Department, and the two senior executives of the arsenal are basically enough to build the framework of vocational colleges in the military industry. As for other industries, they can be used as a blueprint and then slowly expanded in the future. After giving instructions for the vocational school, Joseph and his father discussed the plan for mass production of the August 1790 rifle until dusk. The two returned to the Palace of Versailles exhausted and excited to prepare for dinner. Chapter 538. It turns out that I'm really His Highness's chief mistress. On the way to the banquet hall, Joseph always felt that the nobles were still respectful to him, but the smile on their faces was meaningful. He turned to Louis XVI and asked, Father, is there something on my face? Oh, no, dear, I'm sure. Louis XVI paused, suddenly blinked at his son, and whispered, about the night before yesterday, the two young ladies, really had a fight at your place. Joseph immediately held his forehead. No wonder they looked at him with a wrong look. It turned out to be about this. The Palace of Versailles is a ghost place. No one cares about serious things. This gossip spreads really fast. Ahem. In fact, they are just. Joseph's expression is a little constipated. How should this thing be said? It says that Catwoman thinks she owes me a lot of money, so she came to pay it back. She didn't go through the main door, but went through the window, and ended up beating up the maid who was disassembling my bones as an assassin. Louis XVI immediately showed an I understand expression and smiled. Ah, you don't need to explain. You are so old. It's time to have an adult life. No. Joseph looked at his father's determined expression and said helplessly, well, it's up to you. On the second floor of the Palace of Versailles, Miss Sorrel, the Catwoman that the father and son talked about, was looking at Baron Candace nervously. So, Miss Delvaux's new dress was designed by you. The latter flicked his handkerchief and nodded proudly. Yes, it is a work that I'm very satisfied with. May I ask you? Sorrel lowered his head awkwardly. How much does it cost to make that dress? Baron Candace raised his hand and made it to Miss Delvaux paid me 2,300 francs. If you like, I can also help you design a more suitable one for you. Sorrel felt dizzy when he heard this. Oh my god. How could that dress be so expensive? Exclamation mark. If I had known, I should not have rejected the kindness of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, and took back the 5,000 francs originally. I was planning to take a break, but now it seems that I have to continue to make money. After all, more than 2,000 francs is not a small amount. Yes, when she kicked Camelia out that night, the latter's skirt was torn. In the Palace of Versailles, there is no option to mend a skirt, which will be regarded as a joke by the ladies. So there is only one way to deal with a torn skirt, which is to throw it into the trash can. She must compensate Camelia for the skirt, as well as the medical expenses for the treatment of the injury, plus some thoughts of apology. I'm afraid that she will have to prepare 3,000 francs. Sorrel felt that the whole world was overcast. He said goodbye to Baron Candace listlessly and set out on a fundraising journey again. On the other side, Queen Mary, who was attending the ball, pulled her predetermined daughter-in-law and comforted her earnestly. Sasha, you know, a man of Joseph's age is so outstanding, so there will always be girls around him. But please believe me, he is not so easily moved, I promise. 8-year-old Alexandra blinked her beautiful blue eyes and nodded in confusion. Anyway, no matter what Her Majesty the Queen said, nodding was correct, and she mentioned that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was very outstanding. Well, that was indeed true. After dinner, Joseph did not choose to continue working overtime. He was really tired recently, including mental fatigue point. When he returned to the palace, he saw Perna standing in front of the reception room. He was a little surprised. The doctor changed into a white coat. It should be the white coat he gave her, but it was obviously modified, with a waist and a wider neckline to the chest. Well, she didn't seem to have a chest binder today, which made the white coat bumpy and curvy point, and she let her slightly curly long hair go, gently scattered behind her shoulders. On her head was not the usual tricorn hat, but the small swallowtail hat he designed for nurses in general. It was a youthful and beautiful girl style plus the temptation of uniforms. Joseph stopped thinking and greeted Perna with a smile. When did you come back? Mrs. Lammock's birthday party must be very lively, right? I'm really too busy, otherwise I should go to congratulate her. Mrs. Lammock is Perna's mother. Perna seemed very nervous and knelt down to salute and then said, if my mother knew that you were willing to celebrate her birthday, she would be very happy. Seeing that she was still in a daze, Joseph asked in confusion, do you have anything to say? Oh, yes, Your Highness. Perna hurriedly picked up an exquisite box from behind her and held it in front of Joseph with both hands. This is what Mrs. Lavoisier asked me to pass on to you. Joseph took it and opened it and saw a pair of gold hollow swallows inlaid with more than a dozen rubies, which is an ornament used to decorate the scabbard and can be installed at the entrance of the scabbard. She gave me such an expensive thing. Oh, Mrs. Lavoisier said it was custom made for 230,000 francs. Perna, wearing a brand new business suit, was a little at a loss. She suddenly realized that she seemed to be not suitable for being a lobbyist. This clumsy look was like a child who had not reviewed seriously and walked into the examination room. She gritted her teeth and said directly, Your Highness, I would like to ask you to pardon Baron Lavoisier. He has made a deep confession and is willing to pay the fine. Please don't let him go to jail. He is actually a good man and has a very high reputation in the French Academy of Sciences. If possible, please give me. Joseph slapped his forehead and remembered that one of the purposes of his return to Versailles this time was to ask his father for a pardon from Lavoisier. As a result, he was busy with the gun and forgot about it. If this is delayed for a while, when the high court process is completed, Lavoisier may really have to stay in jail for a few days. Since Perna brought up this matter, let's do her a favor. So he immediately smiled and said, okay, since you said so, I will ask my father for a pardon. Please tell Baron Lavoisier not to worry about it anymore. Perna was startled. She thought she would have to ask the Crown Prince for at least 2 or 3 hours, but he agreed to her request after only a few words. She suddenly felt warm in her heart. His Royal Highness actually took such good care of her. No, this could be considered partiality. Her chest was beating like a deer. She had long forgotten what she was going to say. She just kept thinking about how His Royal Highness pardoned Mr. Lavoisier's 15-year imprisonment for her without hesitation. You know, there are so many tax farmers who were beheaded in the Louvre Square or had to stay in prison for many years. Among so many people, only Mr. Lavoisier was pardoned. His Royal Highness pardoned him for her face. It turns out that His Royal Highness has always had me in his heart. No wonder Marianne said that she was His Royal Highness's chief. Her face turned red again in an instant, and she didn't dare to say that word in her heart. It turned out that she was the only one who didn't know His Royal Highness's intentions. She was so stupid. In an instant, she felt that the whole world was lit up. Chapter 539 Return to Heaven. West of Reims, village of Meterhen. Paul Leona caressed his old house inch by inch with his hands, as if caressing a rare treasure. Hot tears were already rolling in his eyes, which were always red and swollen due to poisonous gas erosion. This is Leonard's home, the home left to him by his father, which carries his memories from childhood to adulthood. 5 years after losing it, he returned to his hometown full of warmth. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince chopped off Mr. Poker's head, and Leonard saw it with his own eyes. That day when he heard that the tax collectors were going to be beheaded, he and his wife put down their work and went to the Louvre Square to watch, risking the family's starvation. The Poker was so frightened that he kept shaking. He didn't look as arrogant as before when he forced them to pay. Finally, when his ugly and fat head was lifted up by the prison officer, he and his wife shouted with the crowd until their voices became hoarse. However, their child seemed frightened and kept crying. In the end, it was the eldest brother, Dauphin, who showed his brotherly spirit and stood in front of his brothers, loudly telling them that he was a bad person and that God was punishing him to hell. Writing this, I hope readers will remember our domain name Taiwan Novel Network. What Leonard didn't expect the most was that a week later, the master of the Reims district court came to him and asked him to put his fingerprints on several documents, and then told him that his 47 acres of land, as well as real estate, etc., everything paid to Poker will be returned to him in the near future. Even Poker will compensate him 35 francs in compensation. The gentleman was very polite and said that according to the instructions of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, Poker should have paid him twice the compensation for the property he had illegally taken. But Poker had harmed too many people. After dividing all his property, each person could only get a few dozen francs. Of course, Poker should have hidden a lot of property, but it has been difficult to find out. In fact, even if the victims receive justice, they often cannot get back what was taken away from them, let alone the years they lost. Leonard was already very satisfied. He thanked the Lord of the Court profusely and led his family to pray for His Royal Highness the Crown Prince for several hours. Another half-month later, he finally got back his house deed, land deed, and 35 francs in banknotes. Later, Leonard borrowed another 30 francs, with land as collateral. It was easy to borrow money from the bank, and performed an operation on his wife, removing the 2 ulcerated fingers afterwards. The family had their first beef stew in 5 years. Several children held their stomachs and groaned for half the night because they ate too much, but there was no sign of pain on their faces. Leonard was recalling the recent ups and downs when he saw his wife, who was packing her luggage, suddenly stood up straight and looked toward the door. "Honey, what's wrong with you, Sophie?" Mrs. Leonard's face was full of excitement. She picked up her skirt and ran out the door. It's old Sophie. I remember the sound of her hooves when Leonard followed him out of the door. He saw his wife holding the old horse that was already losing some hair, laughing and jumping, as happy as a child. Sophie also rubbed her cheek against her old master, and her eyes seemed a little moist. For farmers like them, horses are simply another pillar of the family. As long as there are horses, there is hope in their lives. Immediately, Madame Leonore began to sob softly again, kissing Sophie's skin that was beginning to loosen, and kept choking. "Old man, I thought we would never see each other again." Father Carlo, who sent the horse over, comforted her, and then crossed himself on his chest. "Thank God. Look, isn't everything getting better, madam?" Leonore nodded and added, "I would also like to thank His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Oh, and the Master of the Tax Bureau. Oh, and the Court of Reims." Father Carlo asked Leonard to put his fingerprint on the document he received from Sophie, declined the hostess's invitation to come in and drink some coffee, and left in a hurry. "It's getting late. I have to rush to baptize little Joseph." "Let's do it next time, Joseph." Leonard was a little surprised. Is he the child of the Trout family? He should have been baptized last week. It's Corgiva's youngest son. The priest smiled and waved his hand. "Well, in the past 2 months, the 4 children born in the village were all named Joseph." I was almost stunned. In this small village of just over 100 households, 1/3 of the villagers have gone bankrupt or fallen into extreme poverty due to various exploitations by tax collectors in the past 10 years, but now 70% to 80% of them have regained their income-owned property. The Crown Prince's prestige in the village is almost second only to God. These simple farmers expressed their gratitude to the Crown Prince in the most direct way by naming their newborn child Joseph. If it was a girl, she would be called Josephine. That was the feminine name for Joseph. In fact, there have been a total of 60,000 to 70,000 newborns named Joseph in France recently. Father Carlo took a few steps and suddenly remembered something. He turned to Leona and said, "By the way, the parish is going to hold a mass for His Royal Highness the Crown Prince next Sunday. You must come to attend." Leona nodded immediately. "We and the children will go, Father." He looked at his wife again and whispered, "How much money do we have left?" 7 francs and 9 sous, Paul. Leona hurriedly said to the priest, "Father Carlo, I want to donate 5 francs for the mass." The Catholic word donation means donation. The priest was stunned and advised, "This is too much, Leona." "No, not much at all. These are all recovered by your highness." Western suburbs of Paris. A dance party was being held in the newly rented courtyard of the Vianel family to celebrate their return of the property from the tax farmer. In fact, their villa has been taken back, but it is still a bit messy, so Mrs. Vianel decided to redecorate it, and they live there temporarily. Although Mr. Vianel's face still bears the traces of his previous hardship, he is already in high spirits. He stood on a chair, tapped the glass in his hand, attracted the attention of the guests, and said loudly, "Thank you all for coming to this ball. Now, let's toast to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, our Son of God." Everyone raised their glasses and echoed loudly, "Cheers to His Royal Highness." "Cheers to the Son of God. May God bless His Royal Highness the Crown Prince." But a few people did not respond, but muttered coldly, "The Crown Prince actually let the nobles be beheaded together with those untouchables. This is simply a humiliation to decent people." Yes, those untouchables also used beheading, which should have been the case for the nobles. Humph, is the royal family going to let all the lowly guys climb over our heads? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 540, Money or Principles. Their words immediately aroused the dissatisfaction of several nobles around them. Someone looked at them and reprimanded, "Gentlemen, you should be ashamed of your nonsense. I go to the Louvre Square almost every day, and all I see there are hateful tax collectors and nothing else. Decent people." Another person was obviously influenced by Rousseau's idea of equality and continued, "The entire people of France should not be called untouchables. At least when called by God. There is no difference between nobles and civilians. Let me tell you, those tax collectors deserve to be humiliated. Your Highness did the right thing. Look at Mr. Vianel. He was almost killed by those guys in San Antonio. I think you sympathize with those tax collectors? They have overcharged me hundreds of francs in recent years." Although those who were dissatisfied with the execution method were forced to back away, they still protested in a low voice, "I don't like those guys either, but maybe one day other nobles will also be deprived of their dignity. That's a rule after all. It shouldn't be changed just because you want it." Seeing that the two groups were quarreling, a middle-aged man stepped forward and advised, "Gentlemen, calm down. Please calm down. Well, you are right. They are all death row prisoners with many evil deeds. What difference does it make whether they are civilians or nobles? All nobles and their duties also maintain their due dignity." "Oh, I'm not saying that rules shouldn't be respected. In fact, haven't you noticed? His Majesty the King uses another way to take care of the status of the nobles who are being sentenced." "Oh, how do you say that?" "It's the newly opened guillotine." The middle-aged man blinked. "Although that thing is very neat and ends with a click, it doesn't have the slightest sense of ceremony. Now if you want to hire an executioner to carry out the execution, you have to pay them separately. They will be executed in front of the cold decapitation machine. Before the execution, they will recite an oath, display the beheading sword that has been passed down for generations, and even chat with the deceased. This traditional and ritualistic execution method is reserved for the nobles. Oh, those commoners can't afford an executioner." When several nobles heard this, their eyes lit up. Yes, it is indeed true. No wonder His Majesty invented the guillotine. It is a thing used to perfunctory civilians. Long Live His Majesty the King. Your Majesty has put in so much effort to maintain the dignity of the nobles. Only a majestic executioner is worthy of the heads of nobles. Joseph never expected that his father's guillotine would soon give rise to a unique execution economics point. In order to show their status, nobles would even buy gorgeous uniforms for executioners, ask them to recite short farewell poems, and hire their assistants to sprinkle flower petals on their own blood. The price of these operations had risen to 500 to 800 francs per executioner after the executions in Louvre Square lasted for half a month, becoming one of the core incomes of the court. Second floor of the Tuileries Palace. Joseph looked at the documents submitted by the General Administration of Taxation and couldn't help but frown slightly. After this period of large-scale purges of tax collectors, a large amount of illegal income was uncovered, and together with fines, a total of 67 million francs were added to the national finance. This is completely different from national bonds and loans that require repayment of principal and interest. This is net income. However, it was already January 1791, and including the funds he had raised before, there was still a gap of more than 30 million to meet the minimum funding requirements for government expenditures. This was far from what he had originally expected. According to Robespierre's report, after knowing that they could not escape their guilt, those big tax collectors chose to transfer their property so that they could be left to their families. In this era, cash is still king. As long as you bury silver coins or banknotes in a secluded place, it will be difficult for neither the tax bureau nor the intelligence bureau to find them. Only the money that the tax collectors had in the bank was confiscated. There are also things that cannot be hidden, such as real estate and real estate, but compared to their total wealth, they are still missing a lot. For example, Bollor had huge shares in more than 10 tax houses. According to Robespierre's estimation, his tax revenue last year should have been as much as 13 million francs. However, only 9 million francs of his property were confiscated this time, and the rest was missing. Joseph slapped the report on the table and let out a long breath. It seemed that he would have to borrow a high interest loan. The total amount is 40 million francs, with an interest of 16%, which should be able to be raised quickly. He was about to ask Emin to summon Brian to discuss the loan plan, but he heard Emin calling outside the door, "Your Highness, Archbishop Brian is here." Brian changed his surname to KO. "Invite him in quickly." Brian entered the room and saluted, then handed a box with unknown contents to Emin, and then said to Joseph, "Your Highness, not long ago, Fuld came to see me on behalf of the tax collectors. They gave my 1 million francs benefit. Such a big deal." Joseph smiled, but he was very satisfied with Brian's honesty, so he asked, "What do they want you to do?" Since Fuld and other tax collector giants usually keep a distance from their subordinates, the illegal activities of the tax collectors have not been found out to them yet, so except for Palayer, Bollor and a few other people who dance more happily, and many giants have not been arrested yet. However, Joseph was sure that with such a large amount of money involved, he would catch them sooner or later. Brian hurriedly said, "Your Highness, they want to negotiate with you. Let me persuade you." "Oh, that is the gift they gave you, which is said to be worth nearly 3 million francs. Emin opened the box on the side, and Joseph saw that it was a pair of silver white bracelets, inlaid with diamonds, which were extremely luxurious. Brian continued, "Fold means that he and the members of the General Association of Tax Farmers can pay a sum of money in exchange for amnesty. They are self-aware and know that they can't escape." Joseph had already ordered the Tax Bureau and the Intelligence Bureau to keep an eye on these people and banned them from leaving France on the grounds that the financial accounts of the General Association of Tax Farmers were unclear. He was ready to refuse immediately. According to his plan, after finding the evidence of the crimes of these tax farmers, they would all be sent to catch a. However, he suddenly remembered the funding gap of more than 30 million. If these guys were killed, it would indeed uphold justice and fairness, but it would probably make a huge amount of property sink into the sea like Bollor did. That's France's wealth. When these people die, their descendants will change their identities and continue to squander the money. France will have to pay high interest loans. Joseph couldn't help but fall into deep thought. Perhaps making the most of them and seeking the greatest benefits for France is the right choice. Chapter 541 Devil Joseph. After an unknown amount of time, Brian, who was standing aside, said carefully, "Your Highness, if this makes you unhappy, then I will go back and tell them not to have such wishful thinking. After all, these evildoers are not eligible for pardon from His Majesty the King." When Joseph heard this, he couldn't help but feel moved in his heart. Yes, I'm accustomed to thinking in the way of the civilized society of later generations, and I have forgotten that this is the age of kingship. Taiwan Novel Network. Why should you reason with those guys? Let them taste the iron fist of the royal power first, and then let's talk about the terms. It's just that I want to be a evil person for once, for tens of millions of francs, let alone being a evil person. There is nothing wrong with being Satan. So, he looked at Brian, smiled and shook his head. "No, please tell them to come here tomorrow afternoon, as you wish, Your Highness." Brian didn't expect the Crown Prince to agree so easily. Just as he was about to say goodbye, he heard Joseph say again, "Oh, by the way, Archbishop, all the 1 million francs they gave you will be invested in industrial development. Fund it. Stay at your place. I'm afraid Mr. Miller will feel itchy when he sees you." Brian sighed inwardly. Although he was a little reluctant to give up, the money was really hot to hold. And as His Highness said, with such a large amount of money, the people from the Notary Investigation Bureau will definitely chase him like crazy. However, Joseph's last sentence made him smile again. "But you will receive half of the annual dividend of this money. Those who deserve rewards will be rewarded, and those who deserve punishment will be punished." Since Brian did not choose to be greedy for the money, he should be encouraged. Brian hurriedly bowed and said, "Thank you, Your Highness. You are so generous. May God bless you. If 1 million francs are placed in the industrial fund, the annual interest will be more than 100,000, half of which is about 50,000 to 60,000. This was last year's revenue, which was not very good. This number will definitely continue to increase in the future. 2 o'clock in the afternoon the next day. Baron Morrel, the negotiator of the Tax Owners Federation, said with a smile, "Your Highness, then according to what Archbishop Brian said before, each of our 7 families will spend 10 million francs to purchase national bonds and pay 100 million francs. A fine of 10,000 francs. La Boutier, Di Perego and the others each purchased 4 million francs of government bonds and paid a fine of 500,000 francs. Look at this." Joseph snorted with a stern face. "HMPH. Things were completely different between then and now, Your Excellency Baron. Now that the guillotine has been erected and the tax bureau has invested so many people in the investigation, do you still want to settle things as easily as before?" Morrel and Fuld looked at each other and immediately changed their words. "You are right. Or double the fine to show our sincerity." They had anticipated before coming that it might not be easy to get through this time, so they discussed the price in advance and then left it to the negotiators to bargain. In their view, this is just a business. Although they will definitely lose money, business is business and there will always be a point where losses can be stopped. Seeing that the Crown Prince was just looking at the teacup in front of him without making a sound, Morrel had to grit his teeth again and said, "Your Highness, then double the fine. This is almost all the funds we can use." After waiting for a few seconds, he spoke again with difficulty. "Then, the interest on the national debt can be doubled. Is that okay?" Joseph suddenly laughed, put down his teacup, and looked at the tax collectors in front of him, and said calmly, "Let me tell you my solution. Oh, there is no room for bargaining. First of all, there is no need to buy any national debt. Viscount Ford, Mr. Hope, Baron Morrel, each will be fined 10 million francs. Mr. Laboutier, Baron Di Perego, Goldmid, fines of 5 million francs per person. Fines for other large tax collectors range from 1 million to 3 million. Several tax collectors took a breath of cold air. National debt is a kind of loan. No matter how much you borrow, you have to pay back the principal and interest. According to the results of their previous discussions, the bottom line is no interest at most. As a result, the Crown Prince simply changed it to a fine, and he didn't even want the principal. Fuld immediately shouted, "Your Highness, you are completely denying us a way to survive. Such money will make us bankrupt." These are your illegal gains, the blood sucked from countless poor French people, and they should be handed over. Joseph glanced at him coldly, raised his hand, and pointed to the door. If you find it unacceptable, please leave. Fooled and others all exchanged glances with dark faces and said nothing. After a moment, Moral stood up hesitantly and said, Your Highness, if I'm willing to pay the fine, can I get a pardon? A pardon? Joseph looked surprised. Did I mention this just now? Moral was anxious. Your Highness, I paid 10 million francs. Can't I still be pardoned by His Majesty the King? You have done many evil things, so it is natural for you to pay a fine. Joseph said calmly, after this, how you will be punished depends on the trial of the High Court. You can't do this. Moral protested loudly, jumping to his feet without even caring about etiquette. If the evidence of their crimes is uncovered, which is almost inevitable, the court will most likely sentence them to death, or at least several decades in prison. Judging from the Crown Prince's intention, there is no need to even think about bribing the judge. Ford also stood up suddenly and said angrily, Your Highness, you are too much. If this is the case, then we really don't need to talk. Humph, the worst that can happen is imprisonment. But I swear, you and the government will not get a penny. Really? Joseph glanced at him with a smile. You at least have a case of forging tax documents, and the tax bureau can arrest you at any time for this reason. You can hide the illegal gains, but I believe that you will tell me where the money is in the end. Fold also smiled. Your Highness, why not tell me frankly? I may be sentenced to death by beheading by the High Court. In this case, why should I hand over the money? Because beheading is not terrible. Joseph suddenly changed to a gloomy and low voice. I heard from the intelligence agency that they have a unique way of torture. First bury most of the prisoner's body in the soil, then cut a slit in his head and pour mercury drop by drop from the incision. As the mercury continues to fall, the prisoner will feel itchy and unbearable, so he will try his best to break free. His body will squeeze upwards like a snake, and continue to squeeze upwards, but his skin is fixed by the soil, and soon, his body will wash out of the skin like a meatball. Chapter 542 Execution. As Joseph whispered like a devil, tax farmers such as Ford trembled all over, and the hair on their backs stood up. However, Joseph continued, I heard that after the skinless meatball drilled out from the ground, it usually survived, and could even run around in pain on the ground. Please stop. Moral was so scared by the torture that he closed his eyes and begged in a trembling voice. Joseph nodded, and seeing that several people were relieved, he suddenly patted his forehead. Oh, I almost forgot. They said there is one last step, which is to pour a bucket of boiling water on the meatball. Moral was so scared that he fell to the ground, and there were water stains on his crotch. The other people also looked like their souls were about to leave their bodies, or they were stroking their chests and vomiting. Of course, the stuff Joseph said was not heard from the intelligence bureau. At most they would do tricks such as smashing fingers and piercing calves with wooden spikes. This is the best of the best in the Diran. The cauldron who was selected from thousands of years of torture. It can definitely make people feel like they are in an endless purgatory after just one listen, and experience the despair and fear from the depths of their souls. Joseph saw that everyone had entered the state, and immediately said sternly, if you think you are tight-lipped enough to keep the secrets of those ill-gotten gains, you can give it a try. No one answered. Most of them were still wiping cold sweats, or fighting against the feeling of churning in their stomachs. Finally, Ford barely recovered, and said very unwillingly, if you force me like this, I will commit suicide. No one will have a good life. Joseph raised his eyelids and said slowly, if you pay the fine and accept the court's trial, I can allow your descendants to inherit the title and the remaining property. Your family and your surname will continue to exist. Seeing that they were still silent, he continued, oh, by the way, except for Bora who ordered the attack and killing of the tax collector, Bero and Ekantla who instigated the caravan to disrupt the country's trade, and Antonal and others whose tax farming was involved in many murders, the others, especially those with fewer criminal records, may not be sentenced to death by the High Court. Exert extreme pressure, then give a little hope, and divide as much as possible. This is always the best strategy, to deal with opponents who resist and groups Morrill quickly compared them, and surprise flashed in his eyes. He obviously belonged to the last type of people mentioned by the Crown Prince. Since he can save his life, why should he be tied to a dying guy like Boror? He has a fortune of more than 14 million. After paying the fine, and deducting various recent expenses, he should be able to leave 2 million for his family and children. Maybe after a few years in prison, he can be bailed out. Thinking of this, he took a deep breath, took 2 steps forward with his cold legs, and said with his head down, "Your Highness, I'm willing to pay the fine. Please keep your promise." Joseph nodded. "You made the right decision. This is the attitude a penitent should have." Fold looked at Morrill in despair, and he was a little envious. He was the president of the General Association of Tax Farmers, and he was in charge of many things in the confrontation with the government this time, so it was natural that he could not get a light sentence. But he hesitated for a long time, and finally he could only accept the prince's solution. He knew very well that the prince had just said that his family and descendants could inherit the title and property, but this was actually the opposite. Even if he was sentenced to death by the court, at least these could be guaranteed. Morrill and others had already compromised, and even if he wanted to continue to resist, he had no hope of winning. What's more, it would give him the possibility of experiencing the terrifying mercury peeling. He swore that, no matter what he was asked to do, he would never want to have anything to do with this thing. Soon, the participants in the talks, the other 2 tax farmers who were sentenced, also accepted Joseph's proposal. As if all their strength had been drained, they left the Tuileries Palace with a dull look, and went to convey the negotiation results to other tax farmers. Just as Fold and others went out, 2 carriages drove out of the Dutch embassy in France. The intelligence agent who was monitoring at the front door of the embassy looked at the tax bureau investigator under the tree opposite, gestured to each other, and the tax bureau people rode on horseback to chase them. They were monitoring Hope here. The Dutch banker was obviously worried that he would be arrested by the tax bureau. The recent deaths of those tax farmers and their men really scared him, so he hid in the Dutch embassy a week ago. Suddenly, the tax bureau heard someone from the embassy shouting, "Mr. Wischoff, have a good trip. Remember to tell my wife that I'm fine in Paris." The investigator turned around and saw Hope standing in front of the window on the 2nd floor of the embassy, waving at the 2 carriages. Someone in the carriage also leaned out and waved back. However, the investigator still followed the 2 carriages cautiously on horseback, and that night, after the people in the carriages checked into the hotel, he carefully observed the group of people in secret. For diplomats, they had no right to stop the car directly for inspection, so they could only use this method. They were all people from the embassy, and they didn't see Hope. Yes, he should still be in the embassy. So, the 2 investigators rushed back to Paris overnight, and continued to squat in the embassy. What the 2 did not expect was that just half an hour after they left, the Dutch diplomats slipped out and used tools to remove the roof of the carriage. Hope immediately stuck his head out from the mezzanine. In another car, Van Kuich also complained and jumped off the roof, but because his legs had been curled up, they had already become numb, and he immediately fell heavily to the ground. The next morning, the 2 disguised themselves and mixed into a caravan. 2 days later, they boarded a ship on the Picardy coast and headed for the nearest British port. More than half a month later, the Paris High Court made a verdict on the big tax farmer Boror, murdering tax officials, murdering 5 other civilians, kidnapping, smuggling and other 16 charges, sentenced him to death by beheading, and added a huge fine of 10 million francs. Although a large number of tax farmers had been tried before, and even headless, their influence was far less than that of Boror. He was a well-known loan shark who controlled more than 1/3 of the loan shark market in northwestern France, and was extremely influential in the political and business circles. However, this time he was sentenced to death. At the same time, the court's verdict also disclosed a large number of his crimes. Even because of his downfall, the largest smuggling gang in northwestern France was dug out. Chapter 543R. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Subsequently, the high courts in several French provinces also disclosed the trials of many tax collectors. Although most of them have not yet been sentenced, the names of those defendants are enough to shock everyone. Ford, the head of the Tax Owners Association, Barlow, the great banker in Paris, Pellier, the second president of the Marseille Chamber of Commerce. Except for Fuld, everyone else didn't even know they were tax collectors. Now, everyone finally understands who the real controller of the tax collectors is, as Barlow was sentenced to death. Everyone fell into ecstasy. Eradicating the black hands behind the scenes was far more exciting than cutting off hundreds of tax collectors led by Paris. People have spontaneously taken to the streets to celebrate in various places, which shows how much people hate the tax collectors, especially in recent times. The government's tax bureau has begun to take over the tax collection work. They are different from the previous ones. Those in the tax office formed a sharp contrast point. The tax officials all speak in a kind tone and do not have the habit of wielding sticks while talking. They will not make things difficult for merchants or factories. They will collect whatever the tax law stipulates. Although Jacobins like Robespierre were idealistic and sometimes acted too radically, their belief in building an equal and free country for the people and maintaining social justice was unambiguous. This makes them very different from the previous officials. At least they do not aim to make money. Therefore, the tax bureau quickly won high praise among the people. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, who presided over the establishment of the tax bureau, has become more and more popular, and people's attitude towards the royal family has become more supportive. On the second floor of the Tuileries Palace, Fulco, the director of the tax bureau, was reporting on the collection of fines. Currently, the total amount collected is 42 million francs. Those who have paid in full include Moral Baron, Baron Pellier, 7 others, and the others are still raising money. Joseph nodded with satisfaction. According to previous estimates, the total fine this time will definitely exceed 100 million francs. Basically, the big tax collectors' pockets have been searched. As for the more than half that had been confiscated, he was not in a hurry. After all, the amount was too huge. This is because the tax collector was preparing the tax package before, so he was able to take out so much at once. Otherwise, even if he has a family fortune of tens of millions, it would be very difficult to take out 2 to 3 million at once. At least there is no need to worry about government funding in the first half of the year, and there is even a considerable surplus. Joseph said to Fulco, I will let the High Court make a judgment against Moral and others as soon as possible. I believe that others will pay fines much faster in the future. 4. A relatively cooperative tax collector like Moral, the punishment can naturally be appropriately lenient, which can be regarded as setting an example for other tax collectors. Fulco continued, Your Highness, as for the assets of Hope and Vanquix, they have not been fully investigated yet. However, Hope's various funds left in the country should not exceed 4 million francs, and Vanquix is about 6, around a million. Joseph suppressed the anger in his heart and said in a deep voice, I have asked Archbishop Talleyrand to send a diplomatic note to the Netherlands. These 2 guys will have to hand over the fine sooner or later and face trial. He had received reports last week that the 2 Dutch plutocrats, Hope and Vanquix, had escaped from France, probably under the cover of the Dutch embassy. According to the intelligence agency's analysis, Hope should have a stand-in who is still in the Dutch embassy. The Dutch Patriot Party originally represented bourgeois forces. It is not surprising that they would protect financial chaebols after taking power. However, the Patriot Party stood on the opposite side of France during the Brabant uprising in the southern Netherlands last time. Now that they have done this again, they must be beaten hard in the future. Joseph couldn't help but feel a little liver ache when he thought of this. Hope and the 2 men took away at least 10 million francs in fines from him. This is all your own money. He was secretly feeling sad when he suddenly heard the sounds of lutes, bagpipes and snare drums coming from outside the window, and many people were singing loudly along with the music. The picture above shows the lute, pictured above is bagpipe. The melody was very familiar, and Joseph curiously came to the window and looked down. On the street south of the Tuileries Palace, I saw a small band holding various musical instruments leading the way, followed by 600 or 700 people. They held a large number of human figures made of straw in their hands and sang loudly as they walked. They looked very happy, as if they were celebrating something. When the group of people got closer, Joseph finally saw the portrait of the scarecrow's face clearly. Although the painting was crude, he could still distinguish Bolor's facial features. Then he heard singing from the crowd, "Ah, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine." People are repeating themselves today. "Ah, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Even if the tax collectors are tyrannical, everything will work out. The target is the hateful tax house." We march forward, singing hallelujah. "Ah, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine." His Royal Highness the Crown Prince once said, as if a prophet had predicted it, humming my little tune. People said happily, "Ah, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Even if it is, they took all our money and everything was possible. Ah, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine." Robespierre and Duport sang in the cafe. "Ah, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Let us look forward to the good days to come." The French people used to be silent, but now the tax farmers say, "I admit my mistakes. Ah, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine." The Dauphin guides us, break the unfair taxation, and let the peaceful life return. Ah, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Drive the tax farmers to the execution platform. Ah, everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Hang the heads of the tax farmers on the street lamps. After listening for a while, Joseph suddenly remembered that this was the famous song "Ah, heir" during the Great Revolution in history. It also has another name, called Street Lamp Happy Song. When Louis XVI fled and was blocked by the National Guard, the citizens of Paris sang this song and escorted him to the Tuileries Palace. Of course, the lyrics at that time were basically about denouncing the king's defection, but now they have been changed to criticize the tax farmers. I thought that if my father had not defected in this life, this song would disappear in the long river of history, but I didn't expect it to stubbornly appear. Not long after, the celebrating team met with another group of people at the street corner, and the number of people suddenly increased to thousands, and they went towards the Louvre Square in a mighty manner. Just as Foucault had finished what he had to say, Joseph immediately changed into an inconspicuous black coat, got on the carriage, and followed the parade with interest. Chapter 544 Quiet Corsica. When the parade arrived at the Louvre Square, there were already several thousand people gathered there, also singing the street lights happy song loudly. Joseph came to the second floor of the Louvre from the side door, and saw the crowd surrounding a circle of open space in the middle of the square, piling hundreds of scarecrows there in a mess. The scarecrows' faces were not clear, but from the shouts of the people, the names of big tax farmers such as Fold, Borel, and Decantler could be heard. Then, an old woman came forward and set those tax farmers on fire, and thunderous cheers suddenly broke out in the square. At this point, I hope readers will remember our domain name Taiwan Novel Network. Let these bastards die. Long live His Royal Highness the Dauphin. Long live His Majesty the King. Thank His Royal Highness the Dauphin and the General Administration of Taxation for sending the devils to hell. Burn the tax farmers. Burn them. The fire was blazing, and people immediately sang around the flames, and some people began to cry bitterly. What Joseph didn't notice was that under the columns on the east side of the Tuileries Palace, tax officials such as Robespierre and Chaumette were also watching the jumping flames, and their expressions were even more excited than the celebrating people. This was the victory they won the first time they challenged a behemoth like the tax farmers, and the newly established tax bureau won a great victory. Looking at the happy and satisfied expressions of the people in the square, they only felt that they had brought fairness and justice to France, and their lives were more brilliant. After a long time, Chaumette suddenly said, "Mr. Robespierre, I'm glad that I accepted your advice, otherwise I would have missed such a great moment." It was Robespierre who called on everyone to join the tax bureau at a Jacobin gathering. At that time, although he made many promises, Chormod was still very hesitant. Most people at the gathering were similar to him and had a rejection attitude towards serving as government officials. However, Robespierre still persuaded many people, including Chormod. Robespierre smiled, then said seriously, "Fortunately I met His Royal Highness the Dauphin, otherwise, he suddenly raised his voice. He is really a very special royal family. A person who can bring justice and happiness to the people. He is far more suitable for doing this than us." Doughty, on the side, seemed even more excited. He was once the most suspicious Jacobin of Robespierre and joined the tax bureau to prove the latter wrong, but now he has become Joseph Scion fan. He then said loudly, "Mr. Rousseau told us how to do it, and His Royal Highness the Dauphin is making it happen. France is great because of them." Robespierre nodded slightly. "Yes, we will witness the great France, Corsica in a light grey villa on the outskirts of Ajaccio." The newly appointed governor Count Beautifocco handed a secret report to the acting commander of the Corsica garrison in front of him. "This is the news that Mr. Girolamo got from the separatist parliamentarians. Although it is not detailed enough, we still have to treat it with caution." Napoleon took the secret report and unfolded it, and saw a list of names on it, and it was written at the back, "Paoli may launch a riot in the mountains in the near future, and these are people who are closely connected with him." Count Beautifocco said nervously, "Most of these people are parliamentarians who are still loyal to Paoli, and there are some senior members of the separatist organization. Perhaps you can mobilize the army in advance and suppress it immediately if there is a problem." After a series of blows, Paula's position in Corsica has plummeted. This made him decide to make a final struggle, mobilizing all the forces he could still influence, promising huge profits, intending to create riots in his hometown. Then, he would risk returning to Corsica, repeating the routine of his father, and taking advantage of the chaos to gather hungry people, to form an army. Napoleon frowned slightly and shook his head, saying, "Governor, there are hundreds of villages in the Cinto Mountains, and the current intelligence is not enough for us to deploy defenses." Count Beautifocco said anxiously, "You must think of a way. The situation has just improved, but there can be no more chaos. His position as governor is far from being stable. If a riot breaks out now, he will most likely be replaced by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince." Napoleon also looked solemn. He had just been promoted and even had the word acting before his position. Naturally, he also hoped that Corsica could stabilize. "No, it is unwise to fight in those mountain villages." He suddenly shook his head. "We should solve the problem from a higher level." "What do you mean?" As the two were talking, the governor's steward came in and saluted, saying, "Sir, there is an officer outside who wants to see Lord Buvanaba." Napoleon saw the captain's face outside through the door, and immediately apologized to Count Beautifocco. "I'm afraid I have something urgent. As for the riot, I will take care of it. Please rest assured." "Oh, thank God. Then I will rely on you." Napoleon said goodbye to the governor, came to the carriage, looked at the officer opposite and said, "Have those people been invited?" "Yes, Commander. They are now in the warehouse south of the camp." "Very good. I'll go see them soon." The car stopped outside the warehouse, and Napoleon immediately heard the curses inside. He smiled, pushed the door, and entered the room, and several soldiers inside stood at attention and saluted him. Napoleon nodded to them, then looked at the three men sitting in the corner, patted his chest and said, "It's an honor to meet you judges. I hope my soldiers don't have any impolite behavior." "It's you lunatic." A judge in his 40s with thin cheeks said angrily, "Let us go back." Another old man also shouted, "You are kidnapping. I will sue you and your soldiers." Napoleon signaled the soldiers to bring chairs, sat down opposite the three people, and smiled. "As long as you judge those prisoners not guilty, I will send you back immediately." He was talking about the more than 400 self-defense soldiers captured when he was clearing out the National Self-Defense Army. After executing some dead officers, he incorporated the remaining soldiers into his own troops. However, although these people were pardoned by the military court, the Corsica court insisted on sentencing them to riots in accordance with the parliamentary decree. According to French regulations, people with such serious crimes cannot join the army. Even if they are forcibly recruited, the general staff will not pay them. "You are dreaming." the thin judge said firmly. I will not do anything that violates the law. The other two judges also had cold faces and said nothing. Napoleon stood up and said to the soldier beside him, it seems that Mr. Judge needs to think about it, so please ensure their safety. I will come again in 10 days, mad man. Let us go. The three judges immediately wanted to pull him to reason, but they were pressed on the chair by the soldiers. Napoleon left the warehouse and said to the officer beside him, please transfer 2 companies. Oh, the companies of Labo and Boileau. Meet in front of the Parliament Hall tomorrow morning. Yes, Commander. Chapter 545 Taking the Emperor's Thunder. The next day. In the square 2 streets away from the Ajaccio Parliament Hall, more than 200 fully armed soldiers lined up neatly in 2 square formations and looked at Lieutenant Colonel Bourguiba on horseback. Not long ago, we just saved Corsica from that group of rebels. Napoleon raised his riding crop and pointed in the direction of the Parliament Hall. And now, there is another group of conspirators ready to destroy this peaceful life. According to the intelligence I have received, those separatist MPs who are incompetent, inefficient and only know how to be corrupt will instigate riots in the Cinto Mountains on Paola's orders. You, warriors of France, in order to save this province again, will follow me to arrest those separatists. Completely end this chaotic nightmare. He spoke sonorously and forcefully, completely forgetting that just a few months ago, he was also a member of the separatists. Yes, Commander. The soldiers responded in unison, and then under the command of the officers, they rushed towards the Parliament Hall to the beat of drums behind them. There were several horses dragging 2 6-pound cannons with them. The Corsican Parliament will hold a routine vote today on some policies. As soon as more than 70 members entered the Parliament Hall, some of whom were still yawning, they saw the door being pushed open, and 2 officials from the Ajaccio City Hall ran in and shouted anxiously, Army. Bourguiba is coming with the army. Someone heard him saying that he wanted to arrest the separatists. The congressman stood up in shock and shouted, who gave him this power? I heard that 3 justices were taken away by this guy. He must be crazy. Does he even want to arrest the congressman? What to do? Who is going to stop him? Giuseppe, the leader of the Paulists, jumped on the table, waved his arms and shouted, don't be afraid, everyone. This is the Corsican Parliament. We must unite and let that lunatic and military leader know that Corsicans are never afraid of threats. Immediately, some restorationist MPs followed suit. Yes, Corsica is a place of freedom and democracy, and he is not allowed to act arbitrarily. We are not afraid of him. Everyone, come with me and drive that guy away together. These congressmen rely on their speeches to make a living. Their words are impassioned, and each one of them is like a fearless fighter. Giuseppe took the lead, and dozens of congressmen came to the door of the Parliament Hall in a chaotic manner. They saw a group of French soldiers in white military uniforms coming towards them. He immediately stepped forward and shouted, what are you going to do? Napoleon directed his men to surround the Parliament Hall, then drove his horse to the group of members, raised his hat symbolically, then took out a list of names, looked down at them, and said calmly, in the name of the commander of the Corsican garrison, I declare the arrest of the following rebels who participated in planning the riots: Andrew Alexander Orchard, Sean Chris Bardalo, Richie Romano Greco Giuseppe, Tim Toscaxi. When the soldiers beside him heard this, they immediately stepped forward to arrest him. Although they belonged to the troops stationed in Corsica, they all came from the French mainland provinces. In particular, Labo's company was a grenadier company composed of soldiers specially selected by Napoleon. Although they did not have the tall stature of regular grenadiers, they actually received the treatment of grenadiers. These soldiers are all direct descendants trained by Napoleon, and don't care about Corsican MPs at all. Giuseppe's heart tightened, and he hurriedly signaled to the congressman next to him. They joined hands and stepped forward together, shouting loudly, we are Corsican parliamentarians and represent the Corsican people. You have no right to arrest us. Leave the council chamber immediately, you rude fellows. You are trampling on freedom and the law, and you will be judged. The soldiers were frightened by their confident rhetoric and stopped and turned to look at the commander. Napoleon glanced at the grenadier company commander. Rabo, show your soldiers what to do. Yes, Commander. Labo responded, turned over and dismounted, then strode towards Giuseppe, who was shouting the loudest, raised his hand and whipped him, and shouted, "Shut up, Giuseppe," screamed when he was slapped, and immediately let go of the hands of other congressmen, and backed away in fear. Labo ignored the MPs beside him, followed up and whipped him again, knocking him to the ground, then stepped on his back, and waved his head to the soldiers. "Rope, tie it up for me." "Yes, sir." Labo looked at the other soldiers and said loudly, "Why are you still standing there? Didn't you hear the commander's order?" With him as an example, other soldiers immediately rushed forward and used ropes to tie the congressman whose names Napoleon read. "Everyone, fight with them." Giuseppe's men shouted with anger at this moment. The sound of squeaking wheels came from the direction of the street. The congressman turned around and saw two black cannons appearing in their field of vision. The muzzle of the gun is pointing at itself. A soldier stood beside him holding a fire stick point. In an instant, all the members of Congress who had been struggling and resisting without fear of death stayed where they were. There was dead silence in front of the council chamber. In fact, more than 200 soldiers did not need artillery to deal with these congressmen, and they could not fire cannons when the two sides were mixed together. But the terrifying deterrent power of the cannon is unparalleled. Even if a person can talk eloquently to a flintlock, he will most likely become inarticulate under the gaze of the muzzle point soon. The soldiers stuffed a dozen parliamentarians with their hands tied into the carriage. The power of the Paoli faction in the parliament was almost wiped out. Most of the other parliamentarians who survived the disaster dispersed in fear, while the pro-French parliamentarians looked at the backs of the army and whispered to each other. In gloating. Starting at noon that day, Ajaccio implemented martial law, and a large group of soldiers took to the streets, saying that they were to prevent rebels from inciting riots. 2 days later, the Ajaccio High Court opened. The 3 judges who had been tied up by Napoleon and taken to the warehouse completed the trial procedure in just 1 day under the close protection of the soldiers. They declared Giuseppe and 14 other parliamentarians guilty of conspiracy to incite rebellion and collusion with foreign enemies, and sentenced them to 10 to 20 years in prison, and abolished their parliamentary status. When the news came out, the whole of Corsica was shocked, especially in some areas with serious separatist tendencies, where people were even more excited and ready to launch an armed riot. However, their leaders were now imprisoned in Napoleon's military camp, without anyone who could make decisions, and the funds could not be mobilized, so they could not make any waves at all. And it didn't take long for Napoleon's army to appear in these places, where there were signs of riots. People's restless hearts instantly became calm. Chapter 546 Punishing Napoleon. Half a month later, Napoleon's 17-year-old brother Lucien Bourguiba rushed back to Corsica from Paris to participate in the by-election of Corsican MPs. 14 seats were suddenly vacated in the parliament to re-elect MPs of. Without any surprise, Lucien Bourguiba was elected as a Sota district councillor with a high vote, even though he had almost never been to that place. With the strong operation of his second brother and the support of the governor, Count Buonfuoco, it was not difficult to be elected. In fact, almost all of the 14 by-election seats fell into the hands of people appointed by Napoleon and the Governor General. Second floor of the Tuileries Palace. Joseph looked at the report about the situation in Corsica that Brian had just sent, and couldn't help but rubbed his brows tiredly. He knew that Napoleon could make troubles, and dared to make troubles, so he sent him to Corsica to deal with the problem, but he did not expect that the troubles almost caused a big earthquake. What Napoleon did was simply the behavior of a lawless warlord. Give him a little more power than in history, and he will dare to make moves several times greater than in history. Although he did solve the problem of Corsica's separatist tendencies to a certain extent, he also damaged the image of the French government there. Joseph breathed a sigh of relief and ordered Brian, "Please draft an order." Lieutenant Colonel Bourguiba besieged the Parliament Hall in a very inappropriate way, and must be punished. He should be removed from his position as acting commander of the Corsican garrison. However, there is no suitable replacement for the time being. He commanded the garrison. "Yes, Your Highness." After Joseph finished speaking, he couldn't help but feel a little funny. He was the first person in history to punish someone who took the emperor This was absolutely unimaginable in the previous time and space. I hope this can sharpen Napoleon's arrogant and unruly character, so that he can better utilize the power of his sword in the future. Joseph thought about the current situation in Corsica again. Nothing can be broken without establishing. Now that the old pattern has been broken, construction will begin next. Without Paula's manipulation, as long as the Corsican people can live and work in peace and contentment, who would be willing to carry out separatism? But that place needs resources but not resources, and needs agriculture but not agriculture, so it is really not easy to develop. He thought carefully and quickly remembered a certain island in later generations where the model could be applied. So he looked at Brian and said, "Archbishop, I want to make Corsica a tourist destination. What do you think?" The chief minister thought for a while and nodded. "I think you can definitely give it a try, Your Highness. I have been there before. The sunshine is very comfortable, and the seafood and ham taste good. However, the local residents don't seem to be that gentlemen. Then, the church needs to take the trouble to teach them." Joseph said, "When you go back, make a plan with Mr. Bay. This includes opening a regular ferry from Marseille to Calvi, and the government subsidizes some ferry tickets to attract more people. People go there to visit. In addition, a number of restaurants, massage parlors, and amusement parks will be built there." Brian immediately added, "There are also brothels, Your Highness." "Ahem, that's up to you." Lower Thames Port of London. Before the Marquis of Wellesley even got off the ship, he saw the crowded welcoming procession on the shore and the royal band in neat red uniforms in front of the crowd. When his eyes glanced at a young man surrounded by officials in the middle of the pier, a smile suddenly appeared on his face. That man was the current British Prime Minister William Pitt, to distinguish him from his father. People called him Little Pitt. The ferry Martha docked lightly at the dock. The springboard is lowered. Amidst the loud music, Wellesley stepped onto British soil and immediately walked quickly towards Prime Minister Pitt. The latter also came over with a smile. Before he could salute, he gave him a warm hug and said loudly, "Arthur, did you know? The whole of London is singing the praises of your glorious victory in the Far East. Your outstanding command and heroic battles have stabilized the foundation of the entire country." Wellesley was not at all proud when he was praised, but instead there was a flash of embarrassment in his eyes. He patted his old friend on the back, then took a step back and insisted on saluting in accordance with the rules. "Thank you for coming to pick me up. It makes my day." He glanced at the grand scene around him and said with a dry smile, "I thought there wouldn't be such courtesy. How could you have such an idea? You are a general who has returned victoriously and a hero." Seeing that he had his head lowered, as if thinking about something, Peter waved to the crowds on both sides for him, then ordered him to skip the speech, and pulled him directly into the carriage. Is it the damn malaria that's still tormenting you?" Little Pete looked at his old friend with concern. "You don't look energetic, Marquis." Wellesley still lowered his head and said depressedly, "You know, there is no victory, and I did not defeat the Indian native." "No, you won a great victory." Little Peter immediately corrected, "Britain needs your victory. People don't like the cold truth. More than £3 million and nearly 1,000 soldiers' casualties." Wellesley kept shaking his head. "In the end, they only got a little bit of worthless land and the ridicule of Mysore." Little Pete also sighed and patted his shoulder. "Think of the good. At least you have stabilized our sphere of influence in the Far East. French people." Marquis Wellesley suddenly raised his head, with bloodshot eyes, gritted his teeth and said, "They are all damn French. The Mysore soldiers I captured said that they had all received training from Lafayette, and that guy even made a complete battle plan for Tipu. I even suspect that the fine cannons in Tipu's hands were provided by the French." He clenched his fists and his voice was as low as a beast's roar. "If it weren't for the French, I could have completely defeated Mysore, captured Salingabatan, and then asked Tipu to pay millions of pounds in compensation to redeem it. The entire Indian peninsula will tremble in front of us and obediently give us everything we want. We have to make the damn French bastard pay." Little Pete nodded slowly. "Your political acumen is still so keen. In fact, the current opinions of the entire cabinet are completely consistent with yours. I'm ready to submit this to His Majesty the King soon as the core of the country's future strategy." Wellesley was slightly startled. What do you mean by completely consistent attitude towards France? Little Peter said with a sinister look. Do you know France's trade volume last year? It has exceeded ours. Millions of pounds were made from us. That damn Treaty of Eden. We were cheated. A large number of French industries have caught up with us in the past 2 years, but we still have to maintain the low tariffs in the treaty and watch French goods pour into our market. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 547, Unbalanced Continent. According to the intelligence collected by Lord Grenville, the current cost of France's textile industry is only about 15% higher than ours, and the steel industry has almost caught up with us. The French have discovered huge coal and iron mines in northern Crimea, Russia, which has enabled them to obtain a large amount of high-quality pig iron. As for the wine industry, the French have reduced their costs by 40% compared to 2 years ago, and the quality has even improved. He was talking about the 3 most important industrial fields between Britain and France, either fierce competition or huge trade volume. Little Pete paused, his expression solemn. In short, France is growing stronger like a behemoth at a very fast speed. We were all blinded by arrogance and carelessness before, but now we must first admit the most critical point. That is, we will face an opponent who is more difficult than ever before. This is far from the France during the 7 Years' War. It has begun to break the balance of power on the European continent. The Marquis of Wellesley did not show any shock when he heard this, but seemed to be relieved. My old friend, your strategic sense is still as sharp as ever. To be honest, I have been worried all the way that you have not noticed these things. Little Pitt shook his head and said, this is not my credit, but it is stated in a report submitted by the Duke of Leeds a few months ago. As he said, he took out a stack of documents from the suitcase next to the seat and handed it to Wellesley. I wanted to give it to you in 2 days. After all, you just came back from the Far East and need a good rest. But I suddenly felt that I need you to help me as soon as possible. Oh, of course I firmly support you. Wellesley took the document and immediately saw the words Cabinet Top Secret on the cover. He hesitated and said, I'm not holding a government position now. This may not be appropriate, right? Nothing. Little Pitt waved his hand indifferently. Your opinion is what this report needs most. As he said, he leaned on the armrest, and I hope you can serve as Minister of War. If you don't refuse, you will be a member of the cabinet. Secretary of War? Wellesley was startled. What position is this? Yes, because the British Army had played a trick on the king during the Glorious Revolution, and Britain had little demand for the army, so until now Britain only had the Secretary of the Navy, and the army was managed by several senior generals. Historically, it was Napoleon's huge pressure that made the British set up the Secretary of War 3 years later, and now, it appeared ahead of time. Little Pitt said seriously, as I said just now, we must deal with the French seriously. This is an important military measure. Although you are young, you have accumulated prestige in the battles in the Far East, and the soldiers admire you very much. It is most appropriate for you to integrate the army. Okay, I'll do it. Wellesley nodded without any pretense in front of his old friend. We can't leave this matter to those old-fashioned old guys. In fact, I really have some ideas about the reform of the army. The prospective Minister of War now confidently opened the Duke of Leeds report, quickly browsed it, and continued. According to the news I have obtained about the French army, they have made great progress in the past 2 years. Even surpassed their achievements in industry. The Prussians got some French rifles, and I asked for a few. It is a revolutionary weapon, which the French call percussion gun. Whether in range, power or loading speed, it is much better than our most advanced Brown Bess 1769. It can be said that when our soldiers face this kind of weapon, unless they have a 30% advantage in manpower or the enemy has malaria, they will definitely lose. Little Pitt was not familiar with the military field, and frowned and said, I have also heard of this kind of gun, but Sir Henry Conway thinks it is not a threat. Sir Conway is currently the most senior general in the British Army. That's why I don't like those old-fashioned people. Wellesley curled his lips. They must be beaten before they admit that their set is outdated. Oh, and there are cavalry artillery. Prince Edward and I proposed to vigorously develop this weapon invented by Frederick a few years ago, but our old generals only agreed to build 2 battalions. Do you know how amazingly effective the French cavalry artillery was on the battlefields of the southern Netherlands and Silesia last year? Little Pitt nodded. That's why I made you the Minister of War. You can do all these now, and I will definitely not let the Parliament embarrass you in terms of funding. Only you have this courage. Wellesley cast a grateful look. The French army still has a lot to learn from, but I can assure you that I will give you a strong army that can defeat them. He suddenly stopped in the middle of his speech. The report of the Duke of Leeds made him frown and look up at Little Pitt. Are you sure what is said here is not exaggerated? The latter nodded. The cabinet has held several meetings on this, and everyone agrees with the content of the report. This, Wellesley quickly turned a few pages forward, where it was mentioned that France has stabilized the situation in North African colonies such as Tunisia and Tripoli, initially established a ruling system, and the number of immigrants has continued to rise. Last year alone, more than 70,000 French immigrants went to North Africa, especially in the last month, when the number reached 11,000. This caused the price of the boat ticket from Marseille to Bizerte to rise by 35%. You know, whether it is Britain or Spain, Portugal and other colonial powers, if they want to stabilize and control overseas colonies, they must go through a long time, a series of wars, gradually wear down the resistance of the local population, and invest a lot of money. This usually takes 5 to 10 years. And the French did it in just 1.5 years, although North Africa is very close to France, which gives them a considerable advantage. The speed is really too amazing. In fact, if it weren't for Britain's previous obstruction, this time would be much shorter. Joseph's Roman identity and miracle appearance operations are extremely effective, far from being comparable to the colonial empire that only relies on guns and cannons to persuade. At the same time, the report also said that, although the area of Luxembourg and Wallonia in the southern Netherlands, obtained by France, is small, a large number of coal and iron industries have been rapidly developed in these 2 places. In addition, the residents of the 2 places were already more in agreement with France, so the ruling order was established more quickly. The Duke of Leeds estimated that France could recover all its investments in these places in 2 years at most, or even 1 year. The overseas colonies that France had lost in the 7 Years' War had been largely compensated by these places. Chapter 548 Britain's Strategic Direction. The Marquis of Wellesley also looked solemn. He continued to read the report silently, and saw that the next paragraph talked about France's diplomatic situation. It was also very surprising. As a Bourbon, Spain has always had a very good relationship with France. It goes without saying that the United States has been an ally of France since its independence. Austria is now quite harmonious with France because of the great help France gave them in the Silesian War. The countries in the southern German region signed the Rhine-Seine Treaty with France, and trade was booming. The Dutch Patriot Party had received help from France. Although it was somewhat dissatisfied with the affairs of the southern Netherlands, it generally lived in peace with France. The Italian countries have been looking for a balance between France and Austria, and no one dared to offend either side. Russia cooperated with France to develop the Donbas region. Catherine II was very satisfied with France's investment there. In addition, the trade volume between the 2 countries continued to grow. There were even rumors that she planned to marry her eldest granddaughter to the French Crown Prince. Wellesley's heart sank. Franco-Russian alliance? That would make a terrifying giant appear on the European continent. With the current strength of Austria, Prussia and other countries, they can't compete with the middle. In other words, France's current diplomatic situation is as good as heaven. Except for Prussia, there are almost no hostile countries, and it is very likely to get strong support from Russia. Wellesley narrowed his eyes. He must destroy France's international situation as soon as possible. Otherwise, when it forms a hegemony on the European continent, Britain will never be able to stand out again. This is the continental balance policy that Britain has always adhered to. The European continent must be broken into pieces, and the hegemon must not be allowed to appear. He looked at Little Pitt and said in a deep voice, "It seems that we must take action to maintain the balance." The latter nodded. "Indeed, we don't have much time to waste." He glanced at the position where Wellesley turned to and continued. It also mentioned the various reforms that France has carried out in the past 2 years. It must be admitted that they have done a very good job. They first solved the tax problem and cracked down on those restless nobles. Then they promoted banking reform, straightened out the financial system, and set up an industrial development fund to successfully stabilize the nobles' dissatisfaction. After doing all this, their precarious finances began to stabilize. This is also a guarantee for their rapid development of industry in the future. Then, they carried out land reform and received support from a large number of people. Oh, they recently took back the right to tax. I heard that, although there was a conflict with the tax farmers and hundreds of people were killed, the domestic support was even greater. The Duke of Leeds predicts that after the tax is improved, France's industrial development will be more rapid, which will have a huge impact on our products and the European market. Little Pete glanced at the report again. The Duke of Leeds rarely mentioned the military situation in France before, but you have supplemented it just now. It is also not optimistic. In fact, His Majesty the King has basically agreed to the country's shift to a strategic path against France. At present, I have ordered the cabinet ministers to make strategic plans for their respective areas of responsibility. There will be several discussions later. Oh, you may also have to submit reports on the military. Once all the plans are confirmed, they will be submitted to His Majesty for signature and implementation. He never mentioned Parliament from beginning to end. Although Britain is nominally ruled by Parliament, in fact, those members who can only sensationalize can only make decisions on taxation. For such a major strategy involving the fate of the country, it is basically decided by the elites of the House of Lords and the King. Little Pitt sighed for a long time after saying, "The peaceful life will probably end soon." As the two were talking, the carriage stopped in front of St. James's Palace. When the Marquis of Wellesley got off the car, he saw his mother and brother with more officials waiting here, and there was another cheer all around. "Our hero is back. It's the Guardian of the Far East, the great Marquis of Wellesley." Wellesley felt that these compliments were rather harsh. After a simple hug with his mother and brother, he followed Little Pitt into the ballroom celebrating his triumph. He gave a speech with a forced smile, danced an opening dance, and then shrank into an inconspicuous place, thinking about the next strategy against France. A graceful figure in a white dress floated towards him, holding a wine glass, and standing not far away, expectantly waiting for Wellesley to ask her to dance. This noble lady named Catherine Kitty Parknam was Wellesley's pursuit object, but she was not very interested in him before, until he won the battle in India this time and became famous. She finally changed her mind. However, she waited for more than 10 minutes, but the young officer who used to be passionate about her just lowered his head blankly and said nothing, and had no intention of dancing with her at all. She was a little discouraged and was about to get closer, but saw Foreign Secretary Lord Grenville walking towards him, so she had to stop in disappointment. "Congratulations." Grenville smiled and raised his glass to Wellesley, "To the great victory." "To the victory." The latter clinked glasses with him and exchanged a few words casually, and the topic soon turned to the current British grand strategy. "Indeed, as you said, the current international situation is very beneficial to the French." The Foreign Secretary nodded. "However, there is nothing we can do." Wellesley had also worked in a diplomatic position and knew that it was very difficult to launch a diplomatic attack on France. He was surprised and said, "Do you already have a countermeasure?" "It's just some general ideas that I just wanted to discuss with you." Grenville has always admired Wellesley very much and often said that he was far less smart than him. "I have always believed that you can't be too greedy in anything. If you don't want to give up anything, you will get nothing in the end." Wellesley nodded. "Please continue." In order to better control trade with Russia. We have always disapproved of Russia's claims on Poland. Grenville raised his glass. However, this not only offended our ally Prussia, but also created a situation of disharmony between Prussia and Austria. Wellesley thought for a moment and said, "You mean, our protection of Poland blocks the expansion of Prussia and Austria?" Indeed. Without Russia's participation, it would be difficult for Prussia and Austria to expand eastward, especially Austria. They would even prefer to put their power in Romania. This situation is what the French are most happy to see. Chapter 549 Sacrifice to Poland. Marquis Wellesley nodded slowly. "You are right. As long as Prussia and Austria are unable to expand eastward, they will have no choice but to compete for control of the German region. If a country in this era wants to survive in the jungle of the world, it must continue to strengthen itself. This is the unanimous recognition of everyone. If you don't become strong, you will be swallowed up by the strong. Expansion is undoubtedly the most effective way to enhance strength. Lord Grenville continued. As long as Prussia and Austria continue to fight, no country on the European continent will have the power to threaten France. So, if we want to re-establish the balance of power on the continent, we must first end the hostility between Prussia and Austria. Marquis Wellesley frowned. "I'm afraid this will not be an easy task. They were fighting for Silesia a few months ago, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers from both sides are still facing each other on the front line in Breslau. It's indeed not easy." Grenville nodded. "But it's not impossible. After the war between Prussia and Austria last year, the domestic financial situation has been very bad. You know, the drought in recent years has severely damaged the economy of almost all countries. As far as I know, both Prussia and Austria actually want to end it as soon as possible. Stalemate in Silesia, so, at this time, they need another target to divert their attention. A target that is more attractive and easier to win than Silesia." "You mean Poland?" "It's so easy to discuss issues with you." Grenville smiled. "Pooh and Austria have been fighting in Silesia for so long, and there have been countless casualties, but in fact they have not gained much. If they put their hundreds of thousands of troops into Poland, they would be able to obtain land several times larger than Silesia with little effort. If the time is right, I believe they will not be able to refuse this temptation. No, Prussia and Poland are still allies. This should, believe me, Prussia's desire for the port of Gdansk will make them break any alliance without hesitation. Gdansk is the Danz of later generations. This is the outlet of the Vistula River, which flows through the fertile Eastern European plains from Warsaw to Hungary, and is connected to the Baltic Sea in the north. It is an important node for Eastern Europe to participate in Atlantic maritime trade. At the same time, it is also the closest seaport to Prussia, which has unparalleled appeal to Prussia, which lacks a good port. Later, the core factor in Germany's blitzkrieg against Poland in World War II was to seize Dan's port. The Allied fleet's naval blockade of Germany was mainly launched here. This shows how important its strategic location is. The Marquis of Wellesley swung his glass and said, "Then we are back to the original problem. First, we must have a ceasefire between Prussia and Austria. This requires us to do something, and even pay some necessary prices." Grenville has obviously been planning this for a long time and said confidently, "Fortunately, we can still rely on the power of Russia. You know, Russia wants Minsk and Podolia more than anyone else. Those are the forward camps that give them greater access to the heart of Europe. I believe that Russia should be willing to give up some benefits and make necessary threats for this purpose. If we continue to mediate with this, Prussia and Austria will definitely sign an armistice agreement." Wellesley's eyes also lit up, and he asked the Russians to contribute to serve the British strategic goals. His successor was really a genius in strategic planning. Anyone else would probably have complimented the foreign secretary at this time, but Wellesley thought for a moment and asked again very cautiously, "One last question. Even if we succeed in carving up the interests of Poland and other means to make Prussia and Austria give up their mutual hostility and even form a certain degree of military alliance, how can you guarantee that they will become enemies of France? Especially, Austria is currently an ally with France. Frankly speaking, I don't have a solid plan for this either." The foreign minister spread his hands. At least we have built a force outside France that is strong enough to counter it. Oh, there is one thing we can use. I heard that Queen Maria Ludovica of Shinra hates the French. She should be willing to help us. Oh, I've really been away from Europe for too long, and this happened. It seems that the woman her dear cousin liked was snatched away by the French Dauphin. Grenville showed a playful smile. Later, the French were probably still worried, so they sent assassins to assassinate Baron Walter. Fortunately, he was lucky enough to escape, but he also lost his left hand. Well, yes, after Walter had 3 fingers amputated from his hand, he followed the advice of a well-known British doctor and soaked it in soup, made from more than a dozen kinds of things, including mallow leaves, violets, beetroot, cinnamon, cardamom, etc. The wound, as a result, the pickled left hand became infected without any accident and was completely amputated. Even though he was physically strong, he miraculously resisted the high fever for 5 days and barely managed to survive. However, this brush with hell made him hate the leader who sent the assassins, the French crown prince, even more. So he began to speak ill of the French in Ludovica's ears. In fact, Empress Shinra had previously been resentful of the French royal family because of the humiliation of her daughter's rejection of marriage. At least she firmly believed this, and this, coupled with her cousin's new hatred, has become the target of the anti-French faction in Vienna. Central figure. The Marquis of Wellesley shook his head slightly. These are far from enough. After all, the pro-French forces in Vienna are also very large. We must find the differences in interests between France and Austria and try to expand them so that it is possible to change Vienna's attitude as a whole. Grenville shrugged and said helplessly, but there is no conflict of interest between France and Austria for the time being. There are some common interests, such as the southern Netherlands. Before he finished speaking, Wellesley suddenly thought of something and said excitedly, "You are really a strategic genius." That's right, the southern Netherlands. That's it. The music of the bull lingered in the hall, and the 2 best young politicians in Britain soon smiled during the conversation, and then nodded to each other. In fact, many major decisions that have affected countless countries and killed tens of millions of people did not come from serious discussions in the conference room, but were more likely to be born in such occasions as balls and salons 5 days later in the office at 10 Downing Street. Pitt Jr. looked around at the cabinet ministers sitting there and nodded. "I think Lord Grenville's diplomatic plan is very excellent. This will give us a reliable military alliance on the European continent that can effectively counterbalance France." Chapter 550 Graduation Season of Administration University. Seeing the ministers nodding in agreement, the British Prime Minister continued, "Combined with the other plans you have submitted before, as well as the military deployment just described by the Marquis of Wellesley, I'm confident enough to return France to its rightful place before it becomes a threat to European countries. Yes, a country's overall strategic shift cannot be determined by a casual slap on the head by the Prime Minister." In recent months, the British cabinet mobilized all important ministers and a large number of professional talents to make extremely detailed plans from various aspects such as politics, economy, trade, military, and public opinion. After repeated demonstrations and revisions, the overall plan was roughly finalized. Afterwards, it had to be reviewed and approved by the King and the House of Lords, later commonly known as the House of Lords, before it could be implemented. This requires investing all the resources of the country to fight for the destiny of the next few decades or even a century. Once started, there is no turning back. If it wins, it will dominate Europe and even the entire world. If you lose, you will be unable to recover, and may even face the danger of national subjugation. Therefore, it is absolutely necessary to be cautious and cautious. Little Pete knocked the thick stack of strategic plans in his hand into order, looked around at the ministers again and said, "Then, the entire plan will be submitted to His Majesty the King for signature tomorrow, and then, at this moment, the Home Secretary, the Duke of Portland, coughed slightly hesitantly and interjected, Mr. Pitt, regarding our plans in the area of trade, I think there is room for improvement." The Duke of Portland was a Whig and did not belong to the ruling Tories. But this time, in order to unite all political forces as much as possible, Pitt brought him into the cabinet. Little Pete said hurriedly, "I'm very much looking forward to your suggestions. Actually, I recently came into contact with a Dutchman." The Duke of Portland said, "You may have heard of him, Henry Hope. He has a high reputation in the fields of credit and shipping. He mentioned to me some of France's financial and trade vulnerabilities, and I thought there were some things worth noting." He said, looking at the second Chancellor of the Exchequer. Mr. Wilberforce also very much agrees with his point of view. The British second Chancellor of the Exchequer is actually the financial leader. As for the first Chancellor of the Exchequer, it was naturally Peter the Younger at this time. The UK did not have the position of Prime Minister. The term Prime Minister was just a customary title. Before Peter, it even had a derogatory connotation. In recent years, it has become an honorific title. At present, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer is the de facto top leader of the government. It was not until the early 19th century that the Prime Minister became a formal official position. Wilberforce nodded and said, "Yes, Hope has lived in France for many years and is very familiar with the situation in France. His advice is very helpful. Not long ago, he was persecuted by the French government for some things. We helped him escape to London at the request of the Dutch Parliament. Now he really wants to make the French suffer." Little Pete thought for a moment, put away the documents and nodded. "Very good. Then please issue a report to me on this matter as soon as possible." "Yes, Prime Minister." February 7, 1791. France. Paris on the east bank of the Seine, in the majestic Royal French Administrative University, the graduation interviews for the first class of students are being held. Well, the written examination ended 3 days ago, and the officials who passed the exam entered the interview process. If they passed, they could successfully graduate and continue their official careers. Those who have not passed the written examination will have to continue their second semester, which will last 3 months. As for why it is graduation rather than graduation, I have only studied for half a year and have only scratched the surface of complicated administrative knowledge. Do you want to graduate from college? Do you really think that a diploma from the Royal Academy is so easy to get away with? All courses require 3 years of study, and you can officially graduate only after obtaining enough credits. However, after graduating from the administrative university, their positions will be promoted to one level. Students who have never been an official can directly take up positions such as secretary in charge of the City Hall department, and their future is very good. Therefore, upon seeing this, many officials chose to continue their in-depth studies. After all, it would be difficult for them to get promoted in 3 years just by hanging around in the officialdom. In the interview room, Baron Carlsep looked at the examiner nervously and thought, charging merchants on the main roads into the city can supplement the funds of the City Hall. The money can then be used to widen roads or strengthen market management. His previous position was the assistant financial officer of the City Hall, and he was very familiar with these matters. However, I forgot that the course on tax collection and fees that I just learned last month discussed the disadvantages of card setting and charging from various angles. The examiner shook his head insignificantly and continued to the next question. To be honest, these questions are simply child's play compared to later public examination questions, but for French officials who have never been exposed to this thing, they can really try out something. An hour later, Carlsep left the examination room feeling dizzy. He thought of bribing the examiner out of habit, but he caught a glimpse of the royal guard standing at the door, directly dispatched by Joseph, and gave up the idea. In the afternoon of the next day, Baron Carlsep received the official graduation documents. The school official who came to deliver the documents also informed him that he would attend the graduation ceremony the day after tomorrow. He saw off the assistant of the academic affairs office, took out the graduation documents from the paper bag, and found that there seemed to be something else in the bag. He pulled out the document and found that it was a letter of appointment. There are a lot of clichés at the front, and at the end it says, "In the name of His Majesty the King, Baron Carlsep is appointed to the position of assistant to the Auxiliary Administrative and Financial Management Office of Rouen." He was a little confused and turned to look at his classmate aside. Bangle, the municipal clerk of Rouen, "Have you received the letter of appointment?" "Yes, I received it." But it seems that nothing has changed. I'm still in the same position as before. Me too, but there are two words auxiliary administration in front of it. Oh, I don't have one here. They have no idea that their fate has been completely different. Because of the prefix auxiliary administration. Baron Karl Sepp will stay away from power and enter a state of eating and waiting for death. And Barnell entered a new bureaucracy and started a second life. As for the criteria for the appearance of this prefix, it is entirely determined based on their previous performance, their studies at the University of Administration, and the final interview results. Although these cannot absolutely accurately identify an official, they can somewhat tell some of their attitudes and abilities, as well as whether they like corruption and bribery. Just like Baron Karl Sepp did in the interview, he still stubbornly followed his previous political habits, and it was as if he had not studied at university for half a year. Such an official would naturally lose his job. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.